notebook into the squelching mud, the pages falling open to display the clean slate. "Are you fucking with me?" "Clay, chill out," Dylan said, her voice sharp. "I don't know what you mean," Sylvia replied. "Don't throw it in the mud, please. I won't be able to read it later." "Read what? There's nothing written in it." He plucked the notebook from the ground and fanned the pages in front of Sylvia's face. "They're all like this. All blank." He dropped the notebook onto her lap. She opened it, scanning the pages before turning back to the front cover. "Clay, are you okay?" she asked. "I don't understand what you mean." "It's not blank. None of them are." "Don't fucking play games," Clay said, his breath ragged and words stilted. "You never even took any notes, did you?" "I don't understand. I've been keeping detailed notes, even about the things you saw. The trail, the woman, the dog. You saw me writing. It's all right here." She held the open notebook up to him, her fingers scanning a crisp white sheet. "You guys see it too, right?" she said, turning the page toward Dylan and Luke. "Yeah, I see it," Dylan said. "The page is full." Luke was drifting again. "Sorry," Clay said to Sylvia, his tone suddenly shifting, as if someone had turned the dial of his anger all the way to the lowest level. They were all in on it, the scheming bitches. He couldn't let them know he'd caught on. "You're right. I must have looked at one of the notebooks you hadn't used yet and overreacted. I'm stressed out after yesterday, and worried about Luke. Can you help me figure out what's safe to forage while Dylan keeps an eye on Luke? We need to find something to eat soon, or we'll be fucked." Sylvia said. "Why don't you take a moment to calm down first?" "Sure," Clay said. "Dylan, can you help me find something we can use to put food in?" Sylvia asked. "Sure," she replied. "Clay, will you be okay with Luke for a sec?" "Of course," he replied. He sat across the fire pit with a drooling Luke, while Dylan and Sylvia huddled together near the tents, muttering in low voices. "Are you sure you're okay?" Sylvia asked, returning to the fire pit with a dry bag. "Of course," Clay said. "I'm sorry I overreacted. Let's go forage." "Don't go too far," Dylan warned. "Shout if you need anything, okay?" She shot Sylvia a worried look. Sylvia mouthed, "I'll be okay." Clay feigned composure, letting his rage boil beneath his skin, as he and Sylvia walked toward the tree line with the notebook tucked under his arm. "Is everything okay?" Sylvia asked once they were out of earshot. "Yeah," Clay said. "I just wanted to talk about a game plan for getting Luke out of here, and what we can do to salvage the research." His pulse thumped against his temple. He continued walking, and she trailed like a dog as they followed the stream around the pillar of rock. "Let's focus on finding food while we think through a plan to get help," Sylvia said. "We need to find a source of clean water. Maybe send someone else out again to try to get to the road? Or at least find a spot where we can get a signal to call for help." Clay knew in his bones there was no way out of this place. He stopped short, and the notebook spilled from his arm, its wings bending beneath it, pages soaking in mud. She bent to pick it up. "Why are the notebooks blank?" he asked. "Clay, you're scaring me," Sylvia said, taking a step back. "They aren't blank. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Clay hissed. "It didn't just magically all disappear, did it?" The pressure inside his body boiled. His pulse screamed in his ears so loudly he could hardly hear Sylvia's replies. "I'm not lying," she said. "All I can say is what I know. I took copious notes. They are all right here. Look, there's something weird going on here, and I think maybe—" "I knew I should have picked someone else," Clay growled. His voice boomed through the trees, bouncing from trunk to trunk. "I thought you were my friend." "I am," Sylvia replied. You probably blame me for all of this. For Luke being injured, for us being stuck here. I don't, Clay. Calm down. Nobody thinks that. You all think it's my fault that we're here, trapped in this fucked up place, he snarled. His hands formed into tight fists. You know we're never getting out of here, don't you? There's no way out. But you all agreed to go. I didn't force anyone to come. How was I supposed to know what would happen, what this place is? Clay, what are you talking about? Sylvia asked. She hugged the notebook, lifting it to her chin like a shield. That woman and her dog? There was something wrong with them. I think they were from another time. That's not possible, she replied. Her eyes darted around. You were probably hallucinating from stress or dehydration. Have you been drinking? I know what I fucking saw. I saw a trail, and I saw a huge group pass by, ending with a woman and that fucking flesh-eating dog. Every single night, I've been having hideous nightmares. That's normal to you? No, she admitted. That is odd. But I'm not fucking with you, I swear. I don't know what's going on, but maybe there's some sort of poisonous fungus whose spores travel through the air in the spring, and we're all just inhaling them and having weird reactions. I've seen lots of odd species around camp and in the woods. Species that shouldn't be in Kentucky. There has to be an explanation. There isn't one, he replied. They danced, there in the trees. Clay stepping toward her, his foot claiming the space hers had occupied while she stepped back. That's a shit excuse and you know it. And I know what else. All of you think this is one big fucking joke. You're all making fun of me. Why else would you pretend to write out all those notes? What else did you do? Did you fail to record all the work we did, too? Fuck with the camera? Or remove the SD card? Clay, she stepped back again, her back smacking into a tree. Clay stopped inches from her, could feel the heat and stink of her breath. Why did you do it, Sylvia? He asked between clamped teeth, his hands pinching the meat of her arms, his nails biting skin. Just to mock me? To prevent me from getting my PhD? So you could come back later and steal my idea? Clay, please, she said, squealing. His hands slithered up to her shoulders. Let's go back to camp and we can figure things out. We need to find a way out of here. I keep telling you, he said. There's no way out of here. His fingers crawled, reaching her neck. She slapped them away, slamming the notebook into Clay's stomach, hard. She tore through the forest, her feet kicking up a confetti of leaf litter. Clay stomped after her. The mud squelched beneath his boots. A low growl rumbled from deep inside him, vibrating up through his lungs and between each of his clenched teeth. Ahead, Sylvia darted, nimble as a rabbit, deeper into the trees. In her panic, she ran blindly, away from camp, away from the only other living humans in these woods who could hear her if she screamed. If she made any noise other than huffs of exertion, a steady staccato beat beneath Clay's snarling. The hunger of that place rumbled beneath the soil, rocking the earth under her feet, and it pushed a vine up out of itself, a perfect hook for her boot. She tumbled, face slapping into muck, her forearm smashing into a sharp rock that erupted out of the ground at the moment of impact. Blood gushed down her skin. She rolled over, her other hand clutching the wound, slick already. And then Clay was on top of her. He hugged his thighs tight against her torso, spanning her from rib cage to pelvis. His hands wrapped around her neck, fingertips crushing the little bones of her spine, her thick tendons jumping against his palms. She writhed as if he were performing an exorcism, as if his hands were coated with holy water instead of stagnant sweat. Her blood-coated hand found his squeezing fingers, branding them bright red, too slippery to grip. Her hand slapped and slid, the blood splashing little iron freckles onto both of their faces. Her mouth opened, spat a hollow croak. The hot fire filling Clay's entire body expanded in a sudden burst, and his fingers tightened around her neck. The rock crushing his chest released slowly, lifting away like a balloon the harder he squeezed. Sylvia's eyes bulged from her sockets like a carnival toy. Her bloodied hand smacked against his face, leaving a near-perfect print, a final futile gesture before the exorcism was complete, before she stopped squirming. The rag doll clamped inside Clay's hands went limp, still as the towering wall of granite behind them. Clay could finally breathe. He sucked in deep, lungfuls of oxygen. The tense ache in his muscles smoothed like melted butter. He sat back, his ass falling onto her knees. Beneath him, Sylvia's mouth gaped, displaying a perfect row of bottom teeth. Her eyes bulged, glassy, useless marbles. A red spider bloomed on the skin of her throat, the imprint of his own hands. Her arms splayed at her sides like bird wings stripped of their feathers. Her hair was caked with mud. Clay cocked his head like a puppy. His vision pulled into focus, the red haze subsiding as if drawn out of his veins by a syringe. It took several minutes before her body came into complete focus, before reality settled. As the anger rushed out of him, he turned meek. He swiveled his head as he heard a crunching sound. Had Dylan come to investigate? Had she seen what he'd done? He backtracked, checking behind nearby tree trunks in case she was hiding. He eventually caught sight of her back at camp, sitting next to Luke in the same spot he'd left her. If he perked his ears, he could even hear her voice. He thought he heard his name between garbled scrapes of dialogue. No doubt she and Luke were talking shit. She would ask after Sylvia. She might even leave Luke to go searching. It would be hard to miss that a fourth of the team had vanished. The bottle of moonshine burned against his skin, tucked inside his waistband, and he took a deep glug, gathering strength for what he had to do. He shoveled the litter of the forest onto Sylvia's body. Leaves, twigs, wet slops of dirt he scooped up like ice cream and plopped on top of her. He piled whatever he could find until a mound of loam concealed Sylvia's body. Clay had taken a single step back toward camp when his lips twitched, and the skin of his cheek was pulled beneath the web of Sylvia's dried, caked blood. "Fuck," he whispered. He ripped a square of jersey from his t-shirt and knelt by the creek, using the soaked cloth to wipe his face and hands, rubbing the red around. In the glass of his phone, he checked whether he'd rubbed enough of the blood away to disguise it as rosy exertion. As he approached the campsite, the whispers about him grew louder. The words twisted, smudged and elongated, pulled like taffy. When he stepped out from the trees, standing behind the tents, the comments overlapped, stacked on top of one another until he slapped his hands over his ears. Then the silence of the valley resumed. Luke, as usual, stared off into the trees, his eyes as glossy and empty as the ones Clay had just covered with 2 waxy leaves. Dylan's head pointed in the opposite direction, toward the wall. Behind him, while he folded the bloody square into his pocket and padded back into camp, the ground beneath Sylvia's body roiled like tumultuous waves, ravenous, already picking the flesh from her bones like fried chicken, sucking it down into the rancid earth. It gobbled at her, shredding the meat, slurping her splashing blood. The knobby bones of her spine gleamed, now exposed. Below, the earth continued its feast. March 12th, 2019, 1:05 p.m. "Where's Sylvia?" Dylan asked, her heart sinking. Clay stepped out from between the trees, alone, a dry twig crunching under his boot. "Is he okay?" he responded, nodding toward Luke. "Keeps going in and out. It's happening a little more frequently." He fucked up his bandage. "Oh, shit," she said, pulling his free hand away from it again. Fresh blood flicked off of his nail. "He won't stop scratching at it. I was hoping Sylvia would know what to do." "Where is she?" "He looks bad," Clay said. And he did. Even in the past 2 hours, the swollen discoloration had crawled farther up his leg, now more than halfway to his knee. Dylan stared at it, holding her breath, trying to catch it expanding. The compromised bandage on his arm lapped up blood. Dylan's knuckles were white from trying to keep his wagging finger away. "Yes, he does. I fucking know," she said, her chest suddenly heavy and burning. Luke's hand slithered out of hers, and she snatched it again before it reached its destination. "That's why I need to talk to Sylvia, because she's the only one with any medical training in this group." It seemed like he was doing okay earlier. He seemed okay a little while ago. He stopped scratching, but maybe 20 or 30 minutes ago he picked it back up, and he's been out of it since then. Luke seemed totally oblivious that they were talking about him, right in front of him. "Where is she?" Dylan demanded. Her anxious leg bounced underneath her. Clay did not respond. "You walked off into the woods together. Where did she go? What happened?" His shoulders tensed up to his ears, like they were being pulled by marionette strings. He stared off in the direction where they had disappeared. Why was he being so cagey? A pit opened up in Dylan's stomach. She hadn't liked the thought of Sylvia and Clay going off alone. Something inside her coiled and knotted, a tangled skein of doom when they moved out of sight. She wished she could have gone too, but someone had to stay with Luke. Still, she never imagined that anything more than a screaming match might happen. But now Sylvia was gone. "We were talking about the research, and then we started talking about the GPS," Clay said. "She accused me of breaking it on purpose and dropping it when I went out alone. She said she was going to go try to get help. She left to try to get back to the car." "That doesn't seem like her," Dylan replied. "Leaving without a plan?" "I tried to stop her," he stammered. "I told her she'd get lost without a GPS, but she said she was going to just keep walking until she got a cell signal." "How did you get so dirty?" His head dropped as if this, too, were a mystery. His hands nearly gloved with Kentucky clay. Dark circles stained the knees of his jeans. Something congealed sat at the receding line of his hair. "I tried to run after her, to stop her," he replied. "But, I tripped on a vine and fell." "Are you okay? Is that blood on your shirt?" Sweat dotted his face. A bead ran down, cutting through the rusty dirt on his cheek. Dylan squinted at him, pulled her lips into her mouth to chew on them. He was acting weird. She'd known him for years, and he'd never acted like this before. Never been this nervous to tell her something. The gaps between his replies made her think he was lying. So where was Sylvia? Dylan rewound the past hour of her memory. Had she heard anything that could have been screaming, mistaken for something else? That space in her mind was filled with stock-still silence. Not even the sound of Clay and Sylvia stamping through the brush had dented her recollection. Just calm, suffocating, strangling silence. "Oh, Clay said, his chin to his chest, studying the splatters and streaks on his shirt before scanning his hands, as if they had, at that moment, sprouted from his wrists. "I guess I must have cut myself at some point and not noticed. Probably when I fell." The woods behind the curve of the rock seemed to shiver. What had Clay done? What was he hiding? Her sanity did not want to put the pieces together, to trek into the woods and uncover what she might find. To believe her longtime friend was capable of something so terrible, and she couldn't leave Luke alone with Clay, or get lost herself. Dylan's fingers found the hilt of the knife in her pocket. Would she be able to use it if she needed to? And if she stood, would she be able to resist the pull of the wall? Or would she climb to the top, teetering on shaking hands and feet before she snapped out of the haze? She didn't know what to think. She rubbed her temple, another headache forming. Luke's wagging finger moved right back into place like a magnet. Dylan feared he would eventually tear long, noodly strands of muscle and tendons away from the twin bones of his forearm if left to his own devices. This time, Clay pulled Luke's hand away, stooping between them, and Dylan could smell the rotten, stagnant stank of Clay's sweat, with a metallic scent stirred in. She swallowed the acid burning up her throat as Clay sat across from them. Dylan needed to stay calm. Wait until she had all the facts and figures. Maybe he was telling the truth, even if it sounded ludicrous. He'd never lied to her before. Maybe he was simply nervous on Sylvia's behalf. A silhouette seemed to move through the trees, just far enough away that it could be their missing friend. But it vanished into the deeper woods. It could be a deer. It could be nothing at all. For the rest of the day, they played a demented version of House around the campfire, Clay straightening up the campsite and Dylan tending to Luke. She rested one hand on the knife in her pocket, the smooth metal calming, regulating her pulse, though she couldn't say why it settled her. The hilt grew slick in her palm. Nobody mentioned Sylvia again, as if it had always been just the three of them who trekked down into the valley. Dylan and Clay hardly spoke, and Luke was too far gone for words at this point. The snaps of the fire, like cracking bones, were sound enough. When the sky darkened and the air bit through any warmth the fire might have provided, Dylan led Luke to their tent. In the slow, hobbling journey there, she craned her head back toward Clay. A vision of fireballs dancing in her head, a worry that he might be too scatterbrained to put the fire out when he went to bed, and it would crawl to the trees. Another fear wormed in, that he might spread it himself, starting with their tent, melted polyester raining down and gluing to their faces. Inside the tent, she pulled a thick woolen sock over Luke's curious fingers and then roped it against his chest, both arms now bound as if in a straitjacket. His forefinger continued to twitch underneath the thick fabric, a blood-seeking missile. She hardly slept. Her muscles remained taut, tense knots. Any time she dozed, she dreamed, sharp and clear, of a faceless figure, unzipping the tent, killing her, each instance different, strangling her with the coils of the dirty, broken rope, prying the knife from her sleep-dumb fingers and plunging the short blade into her chest or stomach or neck, pressing a balled-up North Face jacket over her gawping mouth. And while the figure did his slaying, Luke sat, staring directly at nothing, drool pooling at the hinge of his jaw. Luke whispered all night, rocking in the same position for hours, his quiet muttering punctuated by the occasional louder whimper. If it had not been for the unusual stark silence, the normal sounds of the forest would have drowned him out. But there were no owls hooting in this place, no whistling wind, no nighttime crickets. And so, the moments when Luke went statue still, even his fingers stiff, and held his breath as if a predator were just outside the fabric barrier, became even more jarring. Dylan's breath caught in her throat. Her skin prickled and itched, as if thousands of centipedes were crawling across every inch of it. The pair shared that insomniac, claustrophobic space for hours upon hours. Nothing more than a thin sheet of tent barricading them from the horrors of the woods. The things Dylan could only imagine, but somehow it seemed Luke knew intimately. Only when the sun filtered through the polyester, the tent glowing orange like a lantern, morning, at last, did Luke relax his shoulders. As if all the creepy, crawly, terrible things disappeared with the dawn. For a little while. March 13th, 2019, 7:37 a.m. Clay's eyes were tinted red around the iris. He fiddled with a book of matches at the fire pit, sliding his bottle out of view as the others exited their tent. 3 little matches sat in the dirt at his feet, spent, their heads blackened dust. Dylan pulled out a little pin from the hilt of her knife, struck it, and sparked a fire in the dry kindling he'd collected. "Where did you find water?" she asked, nearly tripping over the full kettle. She helped Luke sit. Clay motioned behind him. "There's a creek. Didn't you see it when we came in?" "Yeah, but did you bring a water filter?" "Won't boiling it kill any bacteria?" "I guess," she said. "I don't know what that weird red shit in it is, though. We could see if—" "See if what?" "I was going to say we could see if Sylvia knew. But she's gone. I hope she's okay. Me too. There's a little bit of coffee left, he said, an olive branch. I'll take some, Luke said. Mornings seemed to be when he was at his most lucid. I found it in my backpack this morning, Clay continued. It was in some canister I had forgotten about. It might be old. I'm sure it will taste amazing, Dylan said, the fire jumping, lapping up Oak. But her tone did not match her words. Sylvia's empty tent and her pack sat between his tent and Dylan's like a blemish. Clay tried to forget her, but his body was a reminder of what he'd done. The tendons and muscles in his fingers screamed from overuse. Deep silence permeated the camp, broken only by the low gurgling of water dancing in the kettle, and Luke's fingernails against cotton, followed by the scratchy noise of dry grounds dropping into a tin cup and the hiss of hot water. We need to find food, Dylan said. We need to leave, Clay responded. We can't leave, Dylan said. Luke can't leave. He can barely walk. The gangrene bruise now licked at Luke's kneecap, his foot a ball too swollen for his shoes, stretching the limits even of his dirty sock. Besides, weren't you saying yesterday that we can't leave? Dylan continued. I was just freaked out yesterday, Clay replied. That's ridiculous. Of course there's a way to leave. He knew this wasn't true, but he didn't want to believe it. Do you know anything about foraging? He asked Dylan. Only a little, she said, blowing on the hot coffee. I know some things to avoid, but we'll have to be careful. I think Sylvia said there was a lot of weird stuff, a lot of poisonous stuff. Luke, will you be okay by yourself? Clay asked. I should be, he said. Don't stray too far. After they gulped their coffee, a bitter hot pill, and left the grounds and the cups to reuse, Clay led Dylan into the trees, toward the creek, and away from the corpse he'd buried yesterday. He cleared Sylvia from his mind, wiped away the red welts he'd left on her neck, her bulging eyes. He focused on the cold air against his throat, on his breath pooling in translucent clouds. They brushed the dead debris of the forest floor away with their toes, hoping to uncover some new growth, something green, something edible, something they recognized. Poking out from beneath a log were more of the false fungus toes, purple-gray and sporting black toenails. And for a moment Clay's organs spasmed and clenched, and he panicked, thinking he'd gotten turned around and brought Dylan right to Sylvia's grave. He kicked them. They popped away from the log, soft and spongy, as if rotten. There's something over here, Dylan said. She was crouching by a small bush with dark reddish-purple berries. These could be poison. I don't know what they are. It's all we found. We can figure it out later. They plucked them and filled a pocket of the backpack, the juiciest popping like pimples, spilling sticky dark tar onto their fingers. After the bush stood naked, they padded farther into the woods. Every few steps, Dylan stuck her hand in her pocket, the one she'd slipped her knife into before they left camp. She had to know. She had to be planning something. He'd need to keep an eye on her. Clay snuck a sip of moonshine from the bottle while her back was turned. A patch of dandelions poked their heads out from the brush. The soft yellow petals stuck to the berry pulp, coating their fingers, feathers on tar. They squirreled each decapitated flower head into the backpack. The forest bore other bounty, a mulberry tree with hard white berries, a squirrel's nest of acorns, early violets and clover. Still, they'd only found a small meal's worth for 3 grown adults. They pressed even farther into the woods, straying from Luke, who could have pulled his arm off in the hour or so they'd been searching, who could have cooked his own leg in the fire while he contemplated the fucking forest. The trees duplicated again, like a computerized glitch, and the yellow dandelion heads Clay had just plucked reappeared on its neck. Clay's body had finally acclimated to the dizzying effect, the alcohol making everything blurry at the edges, his head no longer fighting it with a migraine. Now he was simply grateful for the regenerating food source. A shrill, sustained screech bounced between the silent trunks, "I think that's Luke," Dylan said, a bouquet of violet and gold spilling from her palm. She bolted in the direction of the scream. Clay followed after her, stooping to retrieve the flowers first. They'd need all the food they could gather. Clay approached the campsite. Though the scream had died, Luke's mouth was still wide open. He sat stock still, eyes round and bulging, like Sylvia's had been after Clay squeezed. The prying hand was tangled in the stretch of rope Dylan had used to tie it up the previous night. The blue cord looped around his wrist, cutting off the circulation to his hand. It sliced a sharp line into the space where his neck met his shoulder, and Dylan rushed to rescue him from the web, brandishing her knife. For a brief moment, Clay wondered if they should just put him out of his misery. Let the rope do the work. Or the knife. Clay uncorked the bottle. A sharp acetone scent escaped the neck. "Fuck this place," he said. He sipped, recorked, holstered the bottle once more. Once blood returned to Luke's pale fingers, Clay and Dylan spread out their four-edged haul on a small tarp meant to keep the rope clean. They formed little neat rows, surveying the small bounty. The berries, bruised, leaked their sticky juice. It made the gummy energy bars they had run out of look like a fucking four-course meal. "How do we eat this stuff?" Clay asked. "I don't know," Dylan said. "I've heard of dandelion tea, but I'm not sure if you blanch it or just steep it, or whether we can eat any of it raw." "I really wish Sylvia hadn't run off. We could have used her plant knowledge." "I guess we don't have a choice," Clay said, and, as if following a stage cue, his stomach growled, the acid bubbling inside of him, begging for something to digest. "I haven't eaten much more than a few bites of a Cliff Bar in almost a day," Dylan said. "This trip really went to shit." They chewed bitter dandelion greens, raw. They steamed clovers, crushed the unripe mulberries into a tart paste. More boiled creek water, strained through the densest fabric in their packs, soaked into the used coffee grounds. They saved the bright dandelion heads for tea, waiting for the moment when the coffee grounds could expend no more flavor. While Dylan tipped the mashed mulberries into Luke's mouth, the white paste dripping like rabid foam, Clay tipped the neck of the moonshine bottle over his mug. The clear liquid glugged into the coffee, some sort of oily film swimming at the surface. He never wondered how the bottle continued to spill liquor into his cup, when it should have long ago been emptied, even of the dregs. Fall, 1924. The brothers planted the corn in straight rows, dropping each little kernel into the soil, dark and fertile and wet. Throughout the summer, they'd sneak into the clearing in the woods by the edge of their farms to chart the growth, yanking out weeds with grime-streaked hands, thinning out the stalks so each one could suck enough nutrients from the soil, could bleed it dry. In the early August heat, they carefully peeled back the green husks. Red seeped into the white of the kernels. But they were not ready yet. The heirloom Bloody Butcher could only come off the stalks when the color had pervaded each little knob, the whole ear a dark red. So the pair didn't notice that the hue was slightly too dark when they clipped them a couple of weeks later, that each little tooth of a kernel was a little too soft. The harvest took 3 days of stolen time, spare moments while the sun rose or when their wives would cook dinner. When the older brothers twisted off one of the final ears, it popped in his hands. Beneath the husk ran the juices, a deep, staining redness thick as tar. It smelled rotten, and he chucked it away into the forest. Not all of the harvest could be perfect or good. They ground the corn by hand, heated it with malt and yeast, put it through the copper coils of their still, hidden in that valley in the woods, until it ran clear on the other end. The white dog funneled into the green glass. They corked the bottles and sold them, returning to the bare stalks in the woods to stash the cash and celebrate with their own bottle. When they uncorked it, the sharp scent pierced their nostrils, and they toasted to a job well done and sucked it back. A fiery ball followed a line inside each of them, scorching their tongues, their esophaguses, dropping into their stomachs, sizzling the acid there. They sipped. The warming burn edged into their muscles, wormed its way up to their eyes. The gray haze that swelled at the corners of their sight they took for sleepiness. The more they drank, stealing sips in their morning coffee, great glugs before stuffing themselves between starched sheets at night, the more the bottle beckoned. But their stock was thinning. Soon they were down to the last bottle. In the last moments, when their vision went entirely dark and their eyes burned as if boiling in their skulls, their tongues remained parched. They reached for the bottle at the same time, for the final dregs. His throat yearning, the younger brandished a knife and plunged it into the flesh of his brother, feeling the resistance of skin and bone until his prize was won. He took a deep gulp from the bottom, choking down the last drops, before he scratched his eyes out with his own dirt-lined nails. March 13th, 2019, 11:57 a.m. The valley swayed in front of Clay, as if the log he sat on were floating in a vast ocean. The edges of his vision were coated in gray. "My leg hurts," Luke moaned. "Is there any more aspirin?" The bandages wrapped around his foot seemed ready to snap, like a rubber band ball. The cuff of his pant leg clamped around his skin, seemingly extruding the swollen and gorged flesh so tight Dylan couldn't get a single finger between the fabric and skin to roll it up. She pulled out her knife. "Luke," she said, "I need to cut off your pant leg. Your leg is too swollen. I need you to be still while I do this so I don't accidentally hurt you. Ready?" "Yes," he said. His face drained of blood, pale as a corpse. She flipped open the blade and went to work. At the first scratch of the cutting edge, the fabric exploded, like a cattail spilling its seed. Dylan peeled the fabric back, inch by inch, uncovering the extent of the damage, a reality Clay's stomach could have lived without. For a moment, Clay thought the blade was covered in yellowy pus, as if Dylan had sliced through skin. Purple covered Luke's ankle and calf, the skin stretched and shiny, bloated and stinking. Dylan continued cutting while Clay gagged, thinking he might vomit. She continued to uncover more purple until it petered out just a few inches over his kneecap, where his veins stood out like Sharpie lines, little highways pushing out of the rotten forest. "Oh my God," she said. Clay gagged and slapped his hand over his mouth. An unchewed bit of wilted, slimy clover plopped onto the swollen skin from Luke's gaping jaw. The gauze on his arm glistened, wet with fresh blood. His finger tapped between the layers, a frantic pace, as if he were sending out a message with Morse code. His teeth chattered around the rest of the mushy greens in his mouth. "Luke?" Dylan waved her fingers in front of his face, his eyes blinking back to her. "Do you see something?" "Huh?" "How does your leg feel now?" "Better. Cold." "Did you pack any loose pants?" "I think so." She left to ransack their tent, leaving Clay alone with Luke, whose eyes darted across the line of trees. Clay slipped the bottle from his waistband and took a deep glug. He couldn't get through this sober. The alcohol scorched his tongue and sloshed down to his stomach, spreading warmth through his body. Even the soreness in his hands was gone, yesterday's activity a blur. He took one more sip before holstering the bottle. The hazy halo at the periphery of his vision expanded. Dylan stepped out of her tent, her foot squelching in the mud. "Clay!" she called. "Come here!" "What is it?" he said, stumbling to the tent as if his legs had fallen asleep. "Did you do that?" "Do what?" "That," she said, pointing. She stood beside the flayed corpse of a squirrel, the skin of its belly unfolded from its putrid guts, a mess of slick, shiny purple and matte white bone, sharp corners edging the peeled skin as if someone had left in the middle of a high school dissection. Precise, clean cuts. Something white sprouted at the edges of its fur. Clay leaned closer. They were little crystals of ice. Defrosted was the word that crossed the highways of his mind. "What the fuck?" he said, covering his mouth. The alcohol churned up with the dregs of stale coffee. "No, I didn't fucking do that. I've been with you guys this whole time." "Someone did that," she said. "An animal didn't do that. It's too clean. And how is it iced? It's like it froze to death." It was the first animal they'd encountered since they had arrived. Well, besides the flesh-eating dog and whatever Luke said he'd seen in the trees. And it had been pulled inside out. "I don't fucking know," Clay muttered. "What do you think happened?" "I don't know," she said, scanning the trees. "It didn't get this cold last night. We have to get out of here. What if there's someone else in the woods?" "We can't get out of here," Clay said. Everything swayed, blurry. He focused on the zipper head at the top of Dylan's jacket, hoping it would ground him, would keep his stomach from remembering the squirrel guts on the ground. "What do you mean?" she said. "Because the GPS is broken?" "The GPS is gone. I just mean, we can't leave. We tried twice and just ended up back here both times." "Well, Sylvia left, right? She went to go get help and didn't get looped back." Clay didn't respond. He avoided her eyes, looking at his shoes. "That's what you said yesterday, right?" Dylan prodded. "Sylvia ran off to get help?" "I don't know, but yeah, she ran away to get help." Dylan squinted, stuck her hands in her pocket. The squirrel lay between them, and they stared at it as if it would spring to life and scurry away. "Should we eat it?" Clay asked. "I don't know," Dylan replied. "I guess it's meat. Do you think it's rotten?" Their answer arrived when they attempted to pick it up and bring it to the fire. Hands shielded by a trash bag, Clay wrapped his fingers around it, the flesh and guts cold and soft behind the thin plastic. It lifted all in one piece, a flat mass of congealed organs and sinew, as if it had been sitting in a freezer for an entire winter and then left to thaw. A round purple organ plopped away from it into the dirt. Dylan gagged. She swallowed it down, but Clay's disposition failed, and he dropped the thing and ran to the tree line to vomit, sputtering up foamy puke polka-dotted by clover and forest greens. The bitter aftertaste of Clay's vomit coated his teeth, left a film across his tongue. He leaned and spat. "I'd rather starve than eat that thing," he croaked. "Are you okay?" Dylan asked behind him. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied, feeling another wave roiling in his stomach. "I'll be fine. You can go back and deal with Luke." After she patted away, he pulled the bottle from his waistband. He swished the sharp corn liquor around his mouth, the harsh drink rinsing the vomit. He spat it out and took another swig, this one following his throat down to his empty stomach. On the edge of the campsite were more corpses. Clay had wandered away, no longer able to stand Luke, the way he'd stop mid-sentence to have a staring contest with thin air. There were dark brown rats as big as Clay's foot with inch-long cuts across their necks, gummy with old blood. No, frozen blood. Thawing blood. Headless birds, feathers stuck inside the stumps of their necks. One had its wings extended, as if its head had simply evaporated mid-flight, and its body had plummeted to the ground. Once, looking up into the canopy, he discovered 2 talons wrapped around a branch, attached to nothing. The more he drank, the less these sights turned his stomach. They became a morbid curiosity. Was there some demented hunter running around the woods, dropping off things from a deep freezer? Dylan had been right. The slices and dices appeared too neat for an animal. And why would an animal leave its meal behind? Maybe there was a feral band of cats leaving one another gifts. But how had they been frozen? It made no sense. The alcohol sizzled at the back of his throat, and he coughed through the chuckle, meeting it. Maybe he wasn't wrong about the demented hunter. Something was stalking him. Twigs snapped behind him, the sound echoing into the forest canopy. If he turned, the earth swaying with each movement, the sound turned with him, a delicate dance of prey and predator. The noise rang out step by step, slicing through the thick silence. "Fuck this," he said aloud, kicking a rat. Its body exploded in a cloud of sticky blood, gelatinous organs, and crunching bones. Into the trees he screamed, "Why not just kill me now? Get it over with!" He positioned the bottle between himself and the sunlight. Half empty. He'd need more than the few shots left to get him through this hell, and he kicked at the leaves, hoping to find another bottle hiding beneath the loam. He scanned for that familiar glint of sun on dirt-streaked glass, bringing the bottle to his lips over and over. The warmth of it spread through his cheeks, his nose an unfeeling knob at the end of his face. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, and he stumbled back to camp, his face resembled a tomato, his eyes tinged with the juice. The blurring at the periphery of his vision edged in, consuming the foliage in a gray cloud. "Where did you go?" Dylan asked, her hair a blurry haze around her face. Had it always looked like that? "What?" he replied. "Where go?" "Yeah, you just got up and went into the trees. Were you looking for something?" "Am I not fucking allowed to get up?" he replied, heat rising into his cheeks. His feet tangled in the legs of the camping chair. "Wasn't looking. Found more fucking dead animals, though." "What?" Every feature on her face warped, as if her skin was melting. "Lots of them," he continued. His whole body itched, the liquor sloshing like a roiling ocean in his stomach. All he wanted was to free the bottle, sitting hot and smooth against his skin, and drink. If he drank himself to death, it would be a mercy. "Same as the squirrel. All looked like they were carefully murdered, necks slit and shit, heads cut off. Frozen, too, like some psycho playing pranks, fucking with us." "Do you think there's someone else here?" she asked. In the haze, her body doubled, vibrated across the fire. "Like maybe some locals saw us come in, and they've got cell phone disruptors or something, and that's why our phones won't work? Maybe they destroyed all the food while we were sleeping. But how would we have not noticed them? And just, why?" "Dunno," Clay hiccuped. "Why the fuck would someone else come here?" "Are you drunk?" No," Clay replied, swallowing acidic bile. "Did you bring bourbon or something?" Dylan asked. Her eyes moved too quickly inside her skull, the irises blurring as they bounced around, searching his hands and pockets for a flask. "I'm not fucking drunk, okay?" Clay roared. "Jesus, sorry." She poured creek water through the fabric sieve and set the kettle over the embers to boil. Clay's ears perked for any sound, footsteps or rustling brush or villainous laughter, the whiz and whir of some electronic gizmo that might explain why their phones wouldn't work. Clay knew these things did not exist. There was no blocker device, no pranking teenagers hiding behind the thick trunks. That could not possibly explain how they were trapped, how they had moved in a straight line and ended right back where they began, how the trees reproduced into a pixelated distortion like badly rendered CGI the further they went into the woods. Still, he listened, hoping logic would override what they'd witnessed with their own eyes. Dylan dropped the decapitated heads of the dandelions into the tin mugs, the coffee old and spent. The flowers swirled in the water. Clay didn't have the stomach to drink the tea. It looked exactly like piss, and smelled like it too, had the pisser eaten a fuck-ton of asparagus. Dylan took a few tepid sips of hers, but spat it out. They ate more of the bitter greens. They did precisely nothing of use while the sun pooled above them, moving across the sky. Dylan tried to calm Luke, pulled his twitching hand away from his bloody arm 100 more times. Clay closed his eyes, dropped his head into his hands. The earth moved around him. He was adrift. When the sun started to dip below the trees, Clay's stupor finally faded, the cold spring air again nibbling at his face, his nose regaining feeling. For the second time that day, the acid in his stomach churned, boiled up through his esophagus and into his mouth. He bolted. He made it fewer than 10 long steps from his seat before bright greens spewed from between his lips, and he hunched in place to spit out the rest. When he brought the still half-full bottle to his lips to cleanse his mouth this time, he didn't bother trying to hide it. When he lifted his head, wiping away spittle with the back of his wrist, his mouth dropped open. In the dimming light, the woman from the trail stood just beyond the first row of trees, staring. Clay's knees buckled, and he fell back onto his ass, his jeans soaking up the mud. "Oh, fuck," he said, cradling his head in his hands, shutting his eyes tight. "No, this is not happening. It's not real. You're just drunk." He listened for the inevitable approaching footsteps, the ones that would snap branches before snapping bones, breaking off his arm as if it were dry and brittle as a limb on a dead tree, and throwing it to the ground to feed her dog. The silence extended for one single eternity. When he finally opened his eyes, the sun hung just over the tower of rock, a late afternoon wink before the sky would purple. The woman stood there still. Had she moved closer? It was as though the earth had shifted, had pulled the trees closer to where he sat, had folded a piece in on itself. The woman did not blink. Her face gazed back at him in clear focus, the trees around her blurry, a halo of nothing beyond their fuzzy leaves. Her lips were raw and chapped, but clean. Red freckles spread across her face, the tiniest pinpricks dotting the bridge of her nose, and growing larger and longer as they reached her chin. He followed the clear line of blood to her shoulder, where a long wooden hilt hovered, a hatchet blade buried deep in her collar. A waterfall of blood gushed around it, looping like a gif. Her lips spread, cracking with new blood, revealing yellow, mossy teeth. She smiled with those teeth while she pulled the blade from her shoulder, her left arm shifting down, nearly severing from her body in the act. "What the fuck? What the fuck?" he whispered. Clay's transfixion ended the moment she took her first step in his direction. Only then did his feet pedal against the wet ground, his hands scrambling. He managed to get to his feet and screeched all the way back to camp, more bile rising in his throat. "What's going on?" Dylan asked, eyes wide with alarm. She held Luke's hand, the one with the forever wagging finger. "Do you see her?" Clay asked, gulping air and forming words around heaving breaths. "Is she following me?" Hands on his knees, he craned his head around, peering behind him, but also above and below his body, as if the woman might have gained the power of flight or dug a tunnel beneath him. He tensed the muscles in his legs, ready to run. "See who?" Dylan replied, standing and dropping Luke's hand. "Did you see someone?" "That woman," he said. He sucked in air. She didn't appear to have followed, to have left the comfort of the trees. He could no longer see her. "The one I saw on the trail. She had a hatchet in her shoulder." "A hatchet?" Dylan asked. "Are you okay?" "You can see her?" Luke asked. "What the fuck are you guys talking about?" Dylan said. From her pocket, she removed her knife and unfolded the tiny 2-inch blade. She pressed her other hand against her gurgling stomach and stared, as if waiting for the hatchet-wielding woman to appear out of thin air between the trees. But nothing happened. While they waited, poised for battle, all of their energy pointed toward the tree line, Luke screamed. The harsh sound pricked Clay's eardrums and left a static hum in its wake. He and Dylan jumped, turning their feet toward the unmistakable vision that had made Luke shriek. A dinner party in the trees, a whole host of mismatched characters staring back at them. There was a man with a clipped mustache in a singed slate-gray uniform dotted with medals and gleaming golden-threaded star patches. Others in similar garb stood behind him, holding old rifles with blades at the powder-streaked tips, round spots of melted flesh on their faces. The woman with her hatchet and severed spurting arms stood next to a man also splattered with blood, his hand sized perfectly for the hilt of her blade. 2 men hoisted bottles identical to the one burning into Clay's hip, raising them in a toast, deep holes where their eyes should have been. A group of teens with torn and tattered neon windbreakers leered at them. Clay staggered back, knocking his shoulder into Dylan, who stood with her knife out in front of her, a pitiful warning. Luke's mouth maintained the shape of his scream, but no more air escaped. "Fuck," Clay said. "Fuck, fuck, fuck, what the fuck is that?" The party in the trees stood around a long table, empty plates and glassware in front of each guest. Was there always that gap in the trees? Clay wondered. He focused on the geometry of the table, all of the joints and lathe work that must have gone into its construction, as if studying it closely enough would cause it to fade away. It seemed like it was built to fit exactly into that gap in the trees, while somehow not fitting at all. When he stared at one corner to study the joinery, the opposing corners faded, became translucent tree trunks poking straight through the smooth cherry top. The illusion only ever faltered at the corner of his sight, where the gray nothingness crept in farther and farther, leaving him with only a pinhole by which to see. But every speck of his will-powered focus could not blur or mask the oozing smiles the dinner party suddenly revealed, sharp teeth dripping with saliva. Or was it blood? His body tried to run once more. With her free hand, Dylan caught his arm, her strong climbing fingers pinching his skin in a vice, and his body twisted until his ass ate mud. "You can see them too?" Luke asked. "The fucking spooky dinner party?" Clay blurted. "Fuck yes!" "Yes, we can see them," Dylan said, her voice quavering. "So it's not just in my head," Luke replied. The dinner party remained standing, hungry-eyed, but still as statues, until one of them, the man in the slate gray, fingered a knife on the table, considering it. The 3 living campers stood stock still, vibrating with goosebumps. A standoff. "I thought I was just imagining all of this," Luke whispered. "I thought I was just going crazy. I couldn't speak when I was looking at them." "What the fuck do we do?" Clay asked, so low he could hardly even hear himself. As if in answer, the dinner party picked up their utensils, ready to eat. March 13th, 2019, 6:02 p.m. The short, clean blade shivered in Dylan's hand. In the trees, the party didn't move. Though they gripped their rusty knives and bent forks, they did not come rushing to secure their meal. Instead, they kept their yellow smiles pasted to their faces, teeth bared like cornered dogs, and stepped backward into the darkening shade of the trees, disappearing one by one. Sweat slicked across the hilt of Dylan's knife, and even if she'd had the opportunity to swipe it at one of the deadly intruders, she'd more than likely drop it. She switched it to her other hand, releasing Clay, and wiped the sweat onto her pants. This time, Clay stayed put, frozen in place, as if movement was how the people in the trees tracked them. He muttered something under his breath. The sky turned a bright red, the sun having sunk behind the tower of rock an hour before. Darkness crept into the spaces between the trees, breeding shadows there, the valley like a bowl holding the last of the light. Behind the campers, the fire crackled, breaking a huge log in half, spitting orange and red sparks that tickled the back of Dylan's elbows, the crunching carbon the only sound besides their shallow breath. In the accumulating shadows, she saw flashing glints. Eyes? Teeth? Her crazed imagination? Dylan stood poised and waiting for a surprise attack of sharp nails and teeth and rusty blades digging into her flesh. Too many all at once. Her knife knocked from her hand. She switched hands again, wiping away new sweat. Her arms raised goosebumps, as if anticipating the gray hands that would clutch them and pull her backward, her feet scraping through the mud as she disappeared into the forest. Her ears perked for crunching leaves, rustling brush, growling, anything beyond her own ragged breathing. But the woods remained still. Another crack in the fire pit behind them shot a flash of heat against her back. Sweat dewed on the nape of her neck. Luke was the first to move, to pivot his head toward the fire. Dylan's and Clay's shoulders unhitched, and they too relieved their backs of the heat. Before them, the fire had spread. Around the fire pit, a ring of flames burned a clean circle on the ground. This was no random sizzle. Flames, high as their knees, licked around the ring, as if one of the people in the trees had poured kerosene beneath it. "Holy shit," Clay said. "What the fuck?" "We need to leave," Dylan whispered. The flaming ring had to be connected somehow to the people in the trees. She scanned for an exit. "We need to get away from the fire. It's going to spread. We have to go into the woods." She wasn't sure which would be worse, being burned alive or being devoured by ghosts. But the fire was more pressing. She'd deal with the ghosts when they attacked, if they were even real. "We can't fucking leave," Clay replied. "There's no way to leave. We have to try. Help me with Luke." They each took a side and lugged Luke, moving slow, toward the trees, toward the spot they remembered entering from. The sky had already shifted, too quick, to purple, and then a deep, starless, moonless navy. The tiny dot of Dylan's flashlight, a cheap thing built into the end of her pocketknife, poked a pinhole into the dark curtain behind the trees, their bark slick with sap. Reflected flames danced inside the sticky sweetness. Then flames stopped licking and started biting, the ring blurring at the edges as it began to spread. "We're going to die here," Luke said. No one responded to this truth. Dylan and Clay filled the space between the trees with grunts and curses, the party stopping every other minute to suck in oxygen and shake out their tense, knotted limbs. With every 5-legged step, their monstrous silhouette nearly toppled, thorny vines clipping boots, saplings thumping into shins, Luke's bulbous leg catching around a skinny trunk, forcing all of them to pivot and shift. The stink of the rotten meat ballooning beneath his skin pierced Dylan's nostrils, eating through the rank sweat puddling beneath their arms and their bitter dandelion breath. When Luke placed weight on his good foot, Dylan prayed to God, or Satan, or whatever force remained in this hellish place, that it would land, solid, and that ankle wouldn't bend and twist and snap, too. Dylan's stomach boiled inside her, the exertion gobbling the foraged meal, percolating up. She dropped her portion of Luke's weight and vomited. She heaved empty air and fell, her feet sliding in the barf. What the fuck were they doing? They couldn't outrun the flames. Not with Luke to carry. Even now, the growing wall of heat behind them singed the tiny hairs on her exposed skin. For a split second, she considered running into the flames, letting them consume her, put her out of her misery. "We're moving too slow," Clay said, breaking her spiral of despair. "I'll scout ahead," Dylan said, spitting into the dirt. She scraped her dirty boot against a tree, a trail marker of her own slime. "I'll see if I can find the car or a road or something." "Or a trail," Clay whispered, just loud enough for her ears. "I don't think we should split up," Luke replied. "I don't think so either," Clay said. "It never helped us before. Plus, you've got the only flashlight. We'd be completely in the dark." "I won't go too far," she said. "I'll move just a little bit farther ahead than you guys. If I see anything, I can warn you and we can turn around." Dylan strode ahead. The flashlight on the end of her knife neared pointlessness, illuminating half of a leaf or one minuscule knot on a tree. She swung it side to side, the circle slicing through the forest. The monsters could appear at any moment, sudden and close. She cursed herself for not taking 3 extra seconds to grab the big flashlight from their tent. Behind her, Clay and Luke trudged along. 2 steps, 1 hop, repeat. Still slow as hell. If the ghostly party did track by sound, they were surely goners. While Dylan's feet landed soft, her companions crashed through the brush, grinding out curses under their breath and cracking twigs, doing everything short of shouting, "We're over here! Come and get us!" Clay and Luke kicked up so much noise and commotion that she almost missed it. The moment one swing of her flashlight caught the ghosts' hungry, dark-eyed faces, the pendulum swinging away again before the image registered, imprinting on her brain. She forgot to breathe. When she scanned back, trying to catch them in the light again, they had disappeared. "Fuck," she said, sweat pouring out of her palms again. She shook the beam wildly, trying to form a composite picture, trying to catch the path of the ghostly figures. "We need to go a different way," she yelled, her breath returning, ragged and shallow. When she turned back toward Clay and Luke, the swinging light caught on metal, a glint of a wire. Whatever it was half buried in a deep hollow. She carefully picked her way down the short incline and plucked the thing out of the mud. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a spiral notebook. Sylvia's notebook. She flipped it open. Every page was filled, the ink running, the paper stained with mud. What was it doing out here? Had Sylvia dropped it on her way out of the forest? Something wasn't right. Transfixed by the notebook in her hands, she crashed right into an obstacle, like a log but too soft, and her feet twisted below her. She toppled over it, her feet up in the air. Her knife slipped out of her hand, the blade somehow unfolding, stabbing leaves and brush, and not her own skin, thank fuck. The barrel of light connected to it illuminated waves of leaves as it rolled away, before finally settling on a white leather shoe, the toe box sticking up, inches from her face. The heel disappeared into a low mound of loam. Everything moved in slow motion as Dylan wrapped her fingers around the still wet hilt, rolling her knees beneath her and crouching into a low, scrunched ball. Luke and Clay still toiled behind her. Clay's question hanging in the air, "Did you say something?" The light at the end of her blade snaked up the mound. With a shaking hand, Dylan pushed away the detritus. Beyond the shoe was a too-thin leg encased in denim, connecting to a t-shirt that nearly lay flat. The tiny beam could not illuminate everything at once, so Dylan patched this corpse together like a puzzle, her flashlight providing a single piece at a time. A deep blood stain on a cotton sock, a gold rivet set into denim, a gaunt cheek caving into the skeleton, dotted with pale freckles. Wide, glassy eyes had deflated into their sockets, one still pointing up toward the bony tree canopy, the iris of the other pointing right at her. Dehydrated lips peeled back to reveal pearly teeth, even their roots exposed by receding gums, the pink, gummy, and hard like jerky. From the neck spurted blood, an endless stream of it. More than this husk of a person could possibly hold. A puddle formed beneath a neon windbreaker, too much for even the earth to swallow. "What the fuck?" she whispered. Her stomach churned. She started to stand, to gather her weight onto her feet to bolt, but her hand hit more cold skin as she reached out to steady herself. She flung her beam around to reveal another dead person, blood flowing from their thin, desiccated wrists. The little orb of light rested on the teenager's palm. The creak of blood spilled down their hand, filling in the wrinkles, the lifeline etched across the skin. A leaf was stuck to the blood, like a little boat. Dylan stood, trying to ignore the hot wetness soaking into the knees of her pants, her bottom, her hands, every part of her that had touched ground. An aborted scream caught in her throat. The light jumped around on the ground, revealing more and more bodies, 5 in total at the edges of the hollow, circling her like a barrier. Each one poured blood from their wrists or neck, or the backs of their knees, or the insides of their thighs, anywhere arteries ran close to the surface. Too much blood, like a waterfall. Her boots splashed in it, the red that rose around her ankles like a flood, sputtering and spitting up bubbles, as if the earth itself were boiling, as if it were sucking the blood down into itself, slurping and lapping. The dinky light swung, searching for dry land, for a gap between the bodies she could crawl through. The beam scanned these unrecognizable bodies, the faces still youthful, even with the skin pulled back against bone, all of them dressed in what looked like weird 1980s ski lodge cosplay. A dead and breakfast club sprawled at her feet. A copper scent filled her nostrils, like she stood on a mound of pennies. Her pulse slapped at her wrist, along her neck, all those places from which their blood poured like a fountain, like the blood inside her ached to join in. Still searching for an exit, Dylan waded as the puddle became a lake, the blood scalding as it tipped over the lip of her boots, soaking into her socks like hot oil sizzling around bacon. The moment she decided she had no choice but to crunch the corpse's forearms beneath her boots was the same moment the orb of her flashlight fell upon a sixth body. The scream vibrating inside of her did not come boiling out until the light pointed there, directly upon Sylvia's face. Dylan wouldn't have recognized her, except for the University of Kentucky sweatshirt hanging limply around her corpse. What remained of her skin was tinted a purplish green, putrid already, falling away from her bones like well-cooked ribs. Her hair spread like a halo behind her, dyed crimson with blood. Dylan scanned the flashlight beam down, stopping at the spot where her own shoe had knocked loose the flesh on Sylvia's calf as she fell, leaving a clear indentation beneath her friend's jeans. Had Sylvia really gone missing just a day ago? How the fuck was any of this possible? A rotting stench, stark and acrid like 1,000 overboiled eggs, rose from the bodies with sudden force, stirred into the bitter metallic scent of the lake of blood. Dylan retched, spitting clear bile into the still-rising pool. Now it reached halfway up her calf, wicking into the fibers of her pants, little tendrils of it climbing toward her knee. Her boots were like buckets, her socks like sponges. Blisters grew on the delicate skin of her feet, little welts filling with fluid as the hot blood cooked her. Even as the blood rushed in a fast current, threatening to topple her again, Dylan stayed frozen, her synapses firing blanks. How could Sylvia's flesh have melted from her bones overnight? Who were the other bodies? What was this place? Dylan kept her flashlight pointed at Sylvia, passing it over the length of what was left of her body. The underside had melted away from her skeleton, revealing a rib cage full of swelling, rotten organs before her body, too, was drowning in the blood that rose like a filling bathtub. The remaining green flesh on her front, floating like an Ophelia who'd languished for months. Only when the red covered the tip of Sylvia's freckled nose, only when it crested her own knees, did Dylan move. She waded through the roiling liquid, hot and thick. It was impossible to determine whether the snapping beneath her boots was stick or bone. She reached the shore, her feet angled upward, and fought to escape. One foot bit into a chunk of soaked mud, sliding down and pulling her entire left leg with it. The blood lapped at her thigh, as if fighting to pull her under, to do to her whatever it had done to Sylvia. She yelped, a shrill, piercing noise. With one final heave, her hands squishing wet earth, she pushed herself up and out and rolled onto semi-hard ground. The lake ebbed, receded out of the beam of her flashlight. "What's going on?" Luke yelled, a faceless voice in the dark. Dylan pivoted the light behind her, unable to stand. Clay and Luke shuffled toward her, breath extinguished from their lungs, legs and limbs fighting against the forest. She... A sob snaked up her throat, sweat mixed with tears. Suddenly her entire body ached. The blood in her clothes was already congealing, sticky like molasses. "Are you okay?" Clay asked. "What happened? Did you get hurt? Is that your blood?" "I'm okay," she said, her throat sore, her voice husky, her tears flowing as freely as the blood had behind her. In her struggle, the blisters on her feet had popped, and the blood still sloshing in her boots stuck sharp teeth into the raw polka dots of skin. At the end of her blade, the flashlight faltered, flickered out. Darkness surrounded them. Not even light from the fire burning through their campsite reached them any longer. Had she pressed the button while shifting her grip? While trying to find a single dry patch of calloused skin to hold on to it? She clicked it, again and again. It stayed dead. The darkness pressed against her chest like a vice. "What did you see?" Luke asked. "Are they ahead of us?" "I saw," she began. Sylvia's face floated before her again, hot blood collecting in the lashes of her wide-open eyes. She opened her blade and pointed it to where she thought Clay might be. "What the fuck did you do to her?" "What are you talking about?" he replied. She shifted her aim toward his voice. "You know what the fuck I'm talking about! Sylvia!" She clicked the button once more, pointing it toward the blood sauna. The orb finally appeared, faint and dim, but in its perfect circle was the remainder of Sylvia's face, streaks of red dripping away like sweat. Clay's arms fell slack at his side. All of Luke's weight crumpled to the ground. "Shit," Clay said. Early summer, 1982. There was never anything to fucking do in Livingston, unless you could drive out of Livingston. Mark and his friends had become intimate with the boredom. They'd been kicked out of the tiny grocery store for loitering, followed around the hardware store too closely to achieve mischief, and had never been let in the small mom-and-pop boutique stores that lined Main Street. Not that they'd want to peruse dusty racks of felt hats and moth-scented vintage clothes anyway. They were tired of watching MTV in dusty basements on corduroy-lined couches. But there was one pocket of Livingston they hadn't explored. One place whose mention sent tickles across their skin, even now at age 15. The woods that stood behind Maine. They'd heard countless ghost tales about them from older siblings, from childless and wifeless uncles, always punctuated by a chuckle. But there must be some kernel of truth in them. Why else would their parents seem to squirm and change the subject if they asked about camping or hiking back there? The same vague stories rattled around in their heads as they wrapped a case of beer in a blanket and strapped it to the back of Tom's bike, as they dropped their metal frames in a heap just inside the trees and hiked away from town. You know the woods behind the post office? They're filled with ghosts. Ones that want to eat little kids. You go in there, and you'll never come back the same. If you come back at all. One of my old high school buddies went in there, trying to catch a deer, thought it'd be a good place for hunting. When he came out, he'd lost his gun, and his hair had turned white, and he never talked about what happened in there. But they were so fucking bored. So fuck it. They trekked into the haunted woods to get drunk. Being scared would be better than being bored. It was the first weekend of summer vacation, and their moms were already tearing their hair out at their constant presence, shooing them outside and telling them to find something to do. They were just following directions. They found a cozy little hollow among the trees and sat against trunks and on rotten logs. Sipping the bitter bud, they exchanged ghost tales, as many as they knew until they ran out. "This sucks," Mark said. He drained his can, crumpling it beneath his shoe like a squashed beetle, and kicked it into the trees to rust. The early June sun had finally set behind the trees, the air a humid fog. "There's nothing in these woods but bugs." "Maybe the ghosts need to be called," Jimmy said, tossing his empty onto the ground. "Like a seance. Maybe they don't just show up all the time." "A seance?" Susie asked. She and Tom exchanged looks in the same obvious way they'd exchanged saliva behind the school during homeroom. They hadn't signed up for actually conjuring ghosts. They just wanted to drink and sneak away to make out in the dark, carve their initials into a tree. Tom's knife had become sticky with dark sap. "Hell yeah," Julia said. "Let's do it."
"We don't have anything to do it with," Mark said. "Don't you need a Ouija board or something?"
"We have this," Jimmy said, clicking on the gas lantern. "You just need fire, right?"
"Come on, guys," Susie said.
"Let's not." "It's not like it's real or anything," Jimmy said. Then, in a spooky voice, he intoned, "We call upon the spirits that reside in the forest. If you can hear us, give us a sign." The group tensed, tuning their ears to any sudden noise, any hushed whispers that might float through the trees. Clouds descended, obscuring the sky, and a deep darkness pervaded every recess, every gap between the trunks. Everything disappeared except what remained inside the circle of light from the lantern. The light seemed to glimmer, to catch some sort of metal, little flecks in the dirt. But nothing happened. They sipped their beers, dropped the cans, released their shoulders. How could they have been stupid enough to believe in ghosts? Disappointed, Jimmy plucked up the handle of the lantern. The metal seared into his skin, flaming heat raising a stiff welt across his palm, and his fingers released. The glass shattered, spilling shards across dirt, the now released flames licking up any organic matter. Neat tendrils of fire followed a clean circle as if drawn with lighter fluid. "What the fuck?" Mark said, tipping over the edge of the rotten log he'd been sitting on. The darkness inside the trees grew eyes. Susie screamed first, her nearly full can of Budweiser plopping onto the ground, a little geyser of beer spurting from the top. The eyes grew faces, grew bodies, until they stepped into the firelight, forming a circle around the buzzed teenagers. Before any of them could speak, before they could ask who the fuck all these people were, before they could catch all the little ghostly details, the darkened eyes of the men, the hatchet so oversized it seemed ready to chop an ancient tree down, the unmoving bundle in the woman's arms, and the gleaming, dripping smile on the man with the coat with charred edges. The ghosts went to work. They stabbed their nails into the empties, ripping them into shards, which they used to slice against the skin of the teenagers, wrists and necks, and any other exposed arteries gushing into the dirt, filling it, blood pouring out of their bodies until it swam to the edges of the flame-lined ring. The town would call it a suicide pact, would block off the woods with yellow tape, and parents would keep close tabs on their remaining children, letting them go nowhere without a grown-up in sight. All crazed summer adventures halted immediately. They would not have guessed that as these 5 teenagers lost consciousness, as their blood spilled into the hungry earth, the ghosts had licked the bloodied edges of the shards, disappearing only once the lake of blood had extinguished the flames in the circle, one by one. March 13th, 2019, 7:54 p.m. "Fuck," Clay said. "I thought you said she went to get help," Dylan said. "She did," Clay insisted. Sylvia's skin had taken on a dark hue, a deep eggplant purple. The back of her skull, the white bone, created a divot in the dirt. A chunk of cheek plopped away from her face, sinking into the wet earth like gelatin. Clay swallowed moonshine-laden bile. He could still feel Sylvia's smooth skin between his palms. The red welts he'd left there had disappeared beneath the rot. The space where his long fingers squeezed had been entirely consumed, showing bits of spine. It was hard for him to get the full picture. Was Dylan's flashlight dimming? Or had the haziness surrounding his vision crept inward? I guess something must have happened after she left," he lied. "Bullshit!" "Clay, what the fuck?" Luke screamed, using every working limb to scoot as far away as he could manage. "I'm telling the truth, I swear," Clay said. He blinked, squinted, his waning vision still pinpointed on Sylvia, We're not even that far from the campsite, Dylan said. If something happened after she ran away, you would have seen it, heard it. So what are you hiding? Maybe that woman did it, Clay replied. The one I saw on the trail, or all those people we saw in the trees. We would have heard her, Dylan said. Wouldn't she have screamed? I don't know, Clay said. His face flushed. How had her body deteriorated this much overnight? He couldn't have done that. Clearly something fucked up is happening here. Please, I'm telling you the truth. I swear. When you and Sylvia left, Luke said, those people were all still in the trees by the campsite. They didn't disappear until you came back. I don't know, Clay said, words sputtering out before he could stop them. I don't know. I didn't know what I was doing. It was like this fucking place was controlling me. Like it was pushing all this anger into me. I was in some sort of fog, and when it went away, my hands were around her neck and she was limp. So you just fucking left her there? Dylan spat. And lied to us about it? I thought you were her friend. I thought you were my friend. What was I supposed to do? Clay yelled. Not fucking kill her, Luke screamed. Dylan pointed her blade at Clay, some celestial light glinting off the tip. It was the only thing he could see. His vision had become a pinhole, gray nothing haloed around the sharp blade. The bottle dug into his hip, the liquid sloshing and burning against his thigh, as though the flames had boiled it. The raised etchings on the bottle branded the skin at his waist. I thought I knew you, Dylan said, helping Luke up from the ground. I thought we were friends. We're going this way, and you better not fucking follow us. Get lost. Dylan and Luke lumbered away into the trees, leaving Clay alone with Sylvia's body, with the proof of his deed. He retched, the scent of iron and copper tickling his nostrils. He sat in the dark, listening to them struggle away from him, until even their grunts and footsteps through crackling leaves had faded. His eyes did not adjust to the dark. His pupils widened but took in no light. He held his hand in front of his face, waggled his fingers. Nothing. Even in total darkness, he did not need to pat his clothes to find the bottle at his waistband, to slip off the cork and bring the glass to his lips. He sucked deeply from it. The acidic alcohol sloshed over the corners of his mouth. This fucking place. He wished he'd never flown over this swath of trees. Surely there was an undiscovered rock wall in some other place they could have gone. It would have been better to find nothing at all. At least the liquor kept him cozy. Against his back, the rough bark of a tree scratched through the fabric of his clothes. Time stretched as he sipped from the bottle, the gray surrounding him seeming to grow thicker. Had he been sitting there for seconds? Minutes? Hours? It didn't fucking matter. The silence pressed, as dark and heavy as the absence of light, and just as disturbing. If not for the sulfuric scent emitted by Sylvia's body, so pungent he could taste it, he might have hallucinated. Might have pictured himself clawing out of the forest, finding the jeep, and leaving on the open highway. Grabbing a greasy burger from a drive-thru. Hell, even visiting that weird-ass waitress from the rundown diner, just to tell her she was wrong, that there was absolutely nothing in the woods but bugs and leaves and dirt. Instead, he felt like he was in some void that held only rotten air. He stabbed his fingers into the mud, wet earth filling the space beneath his nails, pinching his fingers together, squeezing out a liquid he hoped was rainwater. He even sniffed in Sylvia's stench, deeply, just to have some grounding sensation. But all too quickly his fingers numbed, and his nose had memorized the stink. Everything faded into the background. There was only gray nothingness. He might as well have been in outer space. At the moment when he reached the verge of madness, conjuring more terrors than cozy fast food fantasies, at the point when he could neither feel, nor hear, nor smell, nor see, when he stuck his tongue out into the cold March air in one last-ditch attempt to activate this sense, and tasted not even the smoke from the fire that had raged behind them while they fled. At the point when the moonshine, now down to the dregs, no longer burned but tasted clear as water, he started to hear things. Rustling branches snapping against their siblings. Some sort of human noise. Laughter. Grinding teeth. Sucking in drool. "Who's there? What the fuck is going on?" he called out. He pitched forward, his back lifting away from the rough bark. An ache blossomed along his spine. A muscle in his thigh cramped when he twisted to turn his ear toward the sound. It was as if the soundscape had startled the rest of his senses back into existence, reset everything to factory settings, except for his sight, which remained a blob of gray. The putrid smell of Sylvia again burned the back of his throat, beckoning stomach acid up his esophagus, his equilibrium careening into nausea. A knot of vomit hovered on the back of his tongue. Behind him, wet sounds, like lapping tongues, created an ugly harmony. "Hello? Can you fucking respond? Who the fuck is it?" If his eyes were working, he might have seen what Dylan had. That field of teens from some other era, their blood spilled into the ground, their veins lapping it back up, the memory moving in reverse. He might have noticed their sneakers beginning to twitch, the heels rolling in the dirt, their fingers scratching, drawing claw marks on the wet ground. Soon, their whole bodies convulsed, shaking into life, the blood from their necks and wrists and thighs slowing to a trickle, and then their wounds closing up entirely. They flopped like fish, and Clay twisted his head around toward this thunderous slapping sound. "What the fuck?" he screamed. He rubbed his eyes like they were clogged with debris, like he simply needed to remove some sort of darkening lens. He pitched the bottle to his lips. If he was going to die here, he refused to be sober. But it was empty at last. The slapping noise grew to a crescendo and then stopped, abruptly, as if an invisible conductor had pinched the sound off with his hands. Clay sat still, his fingers fisted into the soil, his eyes glazed. It was not until the teens' mouths opened and emitted a shrill noise that sounded more like a train whistle than a human scream that he scrambled into motion. He pulled himself upright against the tree, his feet gathering his weight, and ran. The young teenagers opened their eyes. They pushed themselves up from the puddle of their own making, turning their eyes to the fleeing man. They zipped up their jackets, the zippers flowing through dirty triangles of magenta, lime, and cyan. Each held a rusty shard of aluminum. The sharp edges were stained by their own blood, covering up the faded red and white Budweiser logos. Their mouths parted into smiles, sharp teeth glistening like bits of quartz. If Clay could see, he might wonder, what light was there to make them glint? "Fuck this place," Clay muttered, stumbling. His foot found a gnarled root, and his knee crashed into a too-close trunk. He pushed himself upright again and continued lurching away from where he'd heard those horrible sounds, his arm in front of him like a shield to catch incoming trees. Though every atom in his body urged him forward, he could only creep slowly through the forest. His arms, swinging ahead of him, grazed a tree trunk. "This isn't real," he whispered. "It can't be real." Not one piece of him believed his mantra. The teenagers kept pace with Clay, staying exactly 6 steps behind their prey, their aluminum shanks shining and glowing. A coiled root pushed out of the earth, waiting to entangle Clay's boot, and he crashed onto the ground, hands catching inevitable razor-sharp thorns, his skin shaving away from his palm like cheese. A low growl escaped his lips. It wasn't supposed to fucking be like this. It wasn't supposed to end in blank darkness and wet, stinking mud. It was supposed to end in glory, in riches. He clawed his way to standing, pulling on low-hanging branches and pushing his weight back over his legs. His clothes hung heavy, drenched in the iron-scented wetness that plugged his nostrils. Little flakes of it dried on the palms of his hands. They chipped away when he smacked against trunks. No, it wouldn't end like this. There had to be a way out. The kid stalked behind him, the distance between them closing only in those moments when Clay fell and righted himself. Once more his foot caught a root or a vine, and he toppled head over heels, his arms pinwheeling in front of him. His knees cracked against rock, his rib cage emitting a loud slap as it landed, his hands and elbows touching down last. He pushed himself up onto aching, screaming knees, felt around in front of him with bruised and bloodied palms. He felt solid ground. No mud, no leaves. Little pebbles rolled beneath his hands. A level patch of them like gravel, like the tiny smooth gray rocks that lined the shoulders of rural highways. He patted his palms farther ahead, darts of pain shooting through his knees. Let them ache. Smooth stone lay ahead. Something flat and warm and just rough enough. Asphalt, he thought. Paved road. I've made it out. I'm going to be okay. He leaned his head down as if to kiss the road. His lips hovered inches above it, and he inhaled deeply, seeking the scent of tar or rubber. It did not cross his mind, as he crouched there, feeling, but not seeing, that he could meet his end splattered on the grill of an 18-wheeler. A laugh bubbled from deep within him, rocketing out of his mouth. He'd fucking done it. He made it out. A snarl interrupted his laughter. Behind him, the teenagers had caught up. They hovered at the edge of the tree line, considering him. In front of him stood the woman from the trail and her dog, her overloaded horse behind her. Long sheets of bedding snapped in the wind, and little trinkets, a child's doll and a rattle, had fallen out of the basket. The woman nodded at the teens. A minute motion Clay could not discern with his gummed-up eyesight. As if this had all been planned, as if the teenagers had driven him to this spot where the woman and her hellhound waited. "Hello? Dylan? Luke," he said, perking his ears. "Is someone there? I need help." The figures surrounding him, closing in, did not respond. The dog growled. "Please," he called. "I can't fucking see anything. I think I fractured my knees and I'm lost." The others moved nearer, their footsteps silent and precise. "Are we at the road? You have to get me to the fucking hospital." "You can't leave." The thought whispered between his ears, and he rolled onto his side, hands covering his face, as a slimy toe knocked against his tailbone. Bony fingers reached into his hair, contracted like a claw machine, and pulled. He reached up, scratching at the deadly grip, trying to yank the fingers out from the tangle of his hair. But they only gripped harder and dragged him down until he lay flat on his back. He screamed into the gray void. The heavy fabric of his shirt pulled taut, rising like a tent between the dog's slimy teeth, ripping with a wet squeal. The dog's sharp nails pressed into his stomach like daggers, the beast's weight heavier than he'd anticipated. The paws squeezed the air from his lungs like a tube of toothpaste. His throat raw, he whispered his useless pleas. Gnarly, curled fingernails poked through the rest of his clothing, sharp as seam rippers. They peeled his pants from his legs, ripped through the laces on his boots, and unraveled his socks in their haste. The feathers from his down jacket tickled his nose as they fell back down like soft snow. Soon the cold night air pockmarked every inch of his skin. His ass rubbed raw against the rough road, and goosebumps populated his crotch. The dog hopped back onto him, and a hot glob of drool dropped onto Clay's naked stomach, searing like lava. His mind reached back to the trail, projecting a little film against the gray for him. The dog ripping flesh from bone, zooming in on the way the skin had snapped like a slingshot the moment it separated from muscle, panning to the flossy tendons stuck between the dog's teeth. A little sliver of white beneath the thick slathers of blood. The dog's wet, cold nose probed his exposed chest, sniffing for the most delicious portion, while a sharp nail scratched in the other direction down his belly, both parties looking for their favorite fleshy spot to sink into. His hands covered his groin. He tensed in anticipation of the dog's teeth stapling through the layer of chewy fat on his stomach. "Please don't," Clay sobbed. With the dog's hungry fangs right above his pounding heart, he dared not move. He could feel its hot breath against his chest. "Please, please, I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean to kill her. Please, shit." The nose and fingernail retreated, the ripped hem of the woman's skirt grazing the hairs on his legs. He kicked his legs up, ready to roll and run, when the teenagers descended upon him. A tangle of hands and knees, their stinking, rotten breath invading his nostrils. Corpse-cold hands pinned his wrists to the ground, and he twisted his legs and bent his knees to cover his middle before another set of hands pulled his ankles down and held them. Bony knees pressed their weight into his thighs. A fifth set of hands pushed their flat palm against his chest before carving into his sternum, performing surgery with the rusted beer can. They worked down in a straight line toward his navel. The can caught on the thick leather of his skin, and a squeal escaped his lips along with a chorus of fuck, 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 fuck. His blood bubbled up and slid down into the round bottom of the can. It steamed against his skin. At his last set of ribs, the sharp triangle of aluminum broke away, sliding beneath the flap of skin. The hand threw that can behind it and picked up the next one. The clink of the first can onto the asphalt was buried beneath Clay's screams, his own breath pooling above him in angry clouds. The world was a gray slate of pain, and he writhed against the icy grips on his limbs. He tried sinking down into the road, a deranged thought ricocheting through his mind. If he'd stayed in the trees, he may very well have been able to escape into the earth. Maybe suffocation, being buried alive in mud, the earth sucking the flesh from his body, would have been easier. But instead, rough pavement scoured his bare back while ghosts sliced through his epidermis. Now onto the third can. They paused at his belly button, stopping only to reposition and cut horizontally, a straight line across his pelvis, a stripe they repeated near his collarbone. At some point, Clay expected to go numb, to have accrued so much pain that his nerve endings would spare his brain from feeling it. But instead, every scratch tore with fresh agony. Every hot, stinking breath blew shivers against the hairs on his arms. Every stretch of already torn skin screamed at the invasion of air. The only parts of him that had numbed were his hands and feet. His throat scratched raw, his screams were extinguished, useless noises that merely inflicted more pain. He wished it would be over. Surely it must be soon. The line across his collarbone now completed, the final can clattered to the ground. Clay inhaled a single breath before hands pushed into the gap, unfolding his skin and muscles like a picnic basket. The hands at his wrists and ankles shuddered. The 5 stomachs surrounding him growled. His tormentors seemed to puzzle at his exposed rib cage, tapping it with their nails and then licking the blood from their fingers with a slurp. Despite his destroyed, dry throat, Clay tried to scream when they dipped all 10 of their hands between his ribs. Then, in matching pairs, the hands pulled in opposite directions, cracking each rib at the same junctures along the sternum and spine, as if the set had been connected to rusted-shut hinges. No longer shielded by skin or bone, his organs lay exposed to the air. Then they feasted. The woman and dog joined them, knees scooting along Clay's twitching, roiling body as the others made space. They stained their hands with his blood, scooping his slippery insides, slurping his intestines like spaghetti. His torso was a buffet, and as their knees trampled his arms and trapped his legs, as their sloppy chewing continued through the thick gray nothing that clouded his eyes, his last wild thoughts were of zombie movies, of campy screen tricks, chocolate syrup as a stand-in for blood, and peeled fruits for organs. right before the dog dove in, squeezing its teeth around his heart. March 13th, 2019, 8:49 p.m. At one point, Dylan had thought herself strong. She could do 10 pull-ups, one right after the other. Hell, just a few days ago, she'd sent 6 brand-new routes in a row and barely felt it. But dragging an awkward 200-pound body through a forest with spongy, uneven ground wore her out quick. She had no destination or sense of direction other than away from Clay. They were just going. Though the light on her knife had flickered out, her pupils had widened, and she could at least distinguish the trees and the spaces between them. With each step, Dylan held her breath, tensing, expecting to stumble into another pile of bodies or puddle of blood, or some fresh horror. Instead, her ankles tangled in a briar patch, little thorns poking holes in her, and she pirouetted into a spiderweb. Losing her balance, she set Luke down as a shrill scream reached them, echoing through the trees.
"What do you think that was?" Luke asked. "Do you think it was Clay?"
"Don't know," Dylan replied, her lungs raw and craving air. Each breath scraped against her throat. "Don't want to know." She stretched her arms, lengthening the tendons, wishing there was a moon in the sky so that she could determine whether they'd been moving for hours or minutes. The sweat that had pooled against her, trapped by her jacket, felt frozen in an icy sheet on her prickling skin. The blood caked to her exterior flaked away in rusty flecks. She shivered.
"What's that?"
Luke asked, pointing with his good hand. An illumination twinkled through the trees, their trunks stark and clear against it, no longer different shades of darkness. "Don't know," Dylan said. A knot formed in her throat. "Maybe the cavalry have come searching. Or maybe we got turned around, and it's just the fire working its way toward us."
"Do you think we should go see what it is?"
"Probably not," she replied. "But it's either go back toward a known killer, or move towards something that only might be a killer. Or could be salvation." After a few more minutes of rest, Dylan heaved Luke up from the ground and swung his arm over her shoulders once more. The orange haze grew, pulsing light through the trees, its heat melting the ice on her skin back into sweat.
"Oh no," Luke said.
"What?
"Are we back at the campsite? Are we right back at the fire?"
More questions she couldn't answer. She was so damn tired. She sighed and pushed forward with Luke's body in tow. Just before the trees spilled open, she stopped. Dylan unlatched her boyfriend and leaned him against a tree like a mannequin. The orange light did burst from a fire, but it wasn't the blaze they had escaped. It was inside a pit, contained by large stones. It burned next to a structure, an old-fashioned log cabin. Right in the middle, where the roof crested, jutted the rock wall, as if it had crashed right on top of the structure or grown out of the earth, slicing the cabin in half. It was the same rock wall Dylan had climbed just 2 days before. She recognized the pits and cracks, chalk from her fingers and black scrapes from the rubber of her shoes smeared across the granite. Neither the cabin nor the wall seemed to belong where they stood, like an optical illusion. Dylan wondered if she stepped to the right or left, whether the back of the structure would appear, whether the angles would align and the vision would right itself, whole and intact. The ground glittered as if it were coated in ice. That, too, must be a weird illusion. Was this their undoing? Or would it be their salvation? The thudding inside Dylan's body provided no answer. The fire gave off just enough light to set the scene, as if it were a high school theater production and not a camping trip to hell. Had darkness not obscured their view, on the other side of the cabin, they would have seen the little mounds of dirt marked with wooden crosses, a graveyard of children. They waited. Dylan held her breath, her eardrums aching from the silence. She crouched, leaning her weight into her knees, while Luke slunk down into the dirt. She pressed her hand against his chest, a signal to wait, as if he could spring out of the trees with his decrepit leg and various slings, as if they had not spent the last few hours trying to traverse a quarter-mile through the woods. The door of the cabin slid open, the drama unfolding like a silent movie, no sound effects or dialogue. A woman exited first, running, carrying a swaddled bundle in her arms. Through the open doorway, behind her emerged a burly man. Before she had made it more than a few steps, he slammed a huge boot down onto the long hem of her skirt, the thick fabric holding strong as she pulled away from him. In her frantic struggle, hoping for a freeing rip, she fell forward. The bundle flew from her arms. A baby rolled out of the swath of fabric. Eyes open, little mouth gaping, still as a doll. Dylan slapped her free hand over her mouth, trapping the scream in her throat. All of the blood rushed out of her face. The woman clawed at the ground, kicking her legs, gripping fistfuls of her skirt and yanking, but it still did not tear around the man's heavy boot. Her hands shot toward her waist, trying to rip the skirt away with her nails, trying to snap the taut stitching. But it would not budge. By the time her finger found a hole in the seam, the man had taken another menacing step across her skirt. She kicked her legs at him, but they became trapped in the folds, in the fabric tomb between his giant feet. The man easily and handily reached down, wrapping his large hands around each of her ankles. The woman's fingers remained caught in the waistband. Her free arm slapped at the ground, hoping to latch onto a root or a weapon or some chunk of dirt big enough to impede movement. When he twisted and pulled on her ankles, she flipped upside down, her face in the suffocating mud. For a moment, the struggling woman turned her head and found Dylan's gaze. Her eyes bulged as if sending out a silent plea, her mouth filled with dirt. Dylan bit her tongue to keep from screeching. Blood filled the gaps between her teeth. The man dragged the woman, pulling her in an arc back toward the cabin and then toward the fire. The woman's free hand sank into mud up to her knuckles, leaving 5 identical trails in her wake. The claw marks raked through the scorched remnants of the circle that had burned across the grass before Dylan and Luke had left camp, blurring the outline. The ash smeared onto the woman's arms and face and hair. Dylan's legs tingled beneath her. She risked shifting her weight to allow blood flow, risked the ear-splitting decibels of a snapping branch that might draw the man's attention. Though the fire blazed some distance away, sweat emptied out of her pores, her bare skin scorching as if she stood right next to the flames, as if she stood right in the middle, burning alive. The woman spoke only in piercing shrieks, and the man replied only with deep grunts. There were no words exchanged, no pleading or bargaining. He moved with mechanical purpose, but not malice, like this was any other task he needed to complete, same as chopping wood or hauling the deer he'd hunted back to the house. An indifference shuffled into his muscles, as if this was simply some unpleasant task he'd put off for too long. The man dropped one of the woman's ankles. With his newly freed hand, he retrieved a large blade from his belt. Luke gasped, and Dylan tensed next to him, wondering if the noise had been too loud, even underneath the woman's screams. Her stomach churned. She squeezed the hilt of her knife, waiting for the moment the man turned toward them, stomping toward his new prey. One-handed, he pulled the woman, still screeching, closer to the fire. Flames danced. Dylan clamped her eyes closed and slapped her hands over them for good measure. There was a dull, wet, thudding sound. And then another. And another. The woman's screaming ricocheted through the trees. And then it didn't. The fire hissed, as if consuming something. Through the air wafted a singed scent, a particular burning smell that Dylan didn't want to accept that she knew. A mix of sulfur and charcoal and meat. Minutes passed. Dylan swallowed bile. "What's happening?" she whispered to Luke. "I can't look."
"He went back inside," Luke replied. "He hasn't come back out or made any noise."
Dylan unpeeled her hands from her face and her lids from her eyes. The scene would be picturesque and quaint, if not for the paths carved into the dirt leading to the fire. She couldn't make her eyes move to the flames, to look directly at what she knew she'd find there. Everything was still. By reflex, some remaining instinct from the world she'd left not even a week ago, she pulled her phone out of her pocket. The top right corner flashed an angry red low battery warning at her. Next to that, a little airplane symbol. She clicked that mode off, and it was replaced by the empty triangle. No signal.
"What are you doing?" Luke asked. "Any signal?"
"No," she replied. "I'm going to take a photo." She clicked open the camera, ignoring the battery warning, and pointed it ahead toward the impossible cabin. But inside the screen, the structure had disappeared. The whole scene before them was gone. No cabin, no fire, just the rock wall, grainy and barely visible. "Try night sight," her phone suggested. "Oh my God," she said.
"What? What do you see?"
"Nothing. Look," she whispered, twisting the screen enough for Luke to see.
"I don't see anything. It just looks like a black screen. Like you're covering the lens."
"Exactly," she said. The phone shook in her jittery hand. "It's not real. It's not actually there."
"What do you mean? It's right there in front of us. We both saw what happened."
"I know, but it's not showing in my camera. It must be, I don't know, some sort of shared hallucination."
"After all the shit we've just seen? You think this is a hallucination?"
"A hallucination, a ghost, whatever the fuck you want to call it. It's not really there," she said. "I'm going to go check it out." She shifted her weight again, pushing up against her heels. The same magnetism that had pulled her toward the wall, that had propelled her to scale 60 feet of treacherous, slippery granite without rope, now tugged at her again, like a hand pressed against her back, pushing her forward, a comforting invitation to exit the trees and knock on the cabin door.
"What?" Luke hissed. "Where are you going? Don't leave me here."
But she had already stepped out into the valley. The fire prickled at the right side of her body, the left side icy and shivering. The flames snapped when she stepped past the fire pit, as if they were baiting her, trying to force her to turn and confront what they were eating. She stalked ahead with her phone in front of her face, hoping it might reveal ghostly breadcrumbs that would lead in a direct path out of the valley, up the hill, and to the car. The screen remained dark. Its lens sucked in nothing but the moonless night. She stood in front of the house as if she had a dinner invitation, breathless with anticipation. The screen did not display the door and its thick, uneven slats of log, scratchy teeth marks from a handsaw etched into it. She reached her hand out. She rubbed it against the door, the buzzing nerves in her fingers incompatible with the reality on the screen. When she pulled her fingers back, a thin splinter of wood stuck out of her thumb. She pivoted, twisting toward the direction of their camp. Inside the phone, their tents were pitched in a row, the fire pit they'd made covered with the embers of the log they'd burned earlier that day, everything dark and outlined in gray. But when she lowered the phone, they all disappeared. "What the fuck?" she whispered. Behind her, hinges groaned, and she pivoted again. The man stood in the open door. Baring his teeth, he reached for his blade. March 13th, 2019, 10:09 p.m. From his spot in the trees, his limbs aching and throbbing and screaming, Luke shouted in the loudest voice he dared for Dylan to come back. He craned his neck to see around the trunks blocking his view. Dylan had disappeared behind one when she approached the cabin.
"Dylan, come on!"
he hissed, low and strained. A burst of pain rocketed up his calf as his weight shifted onto his bad leg.
"What the fuck are you doing? Let's get out of here!"
In answer, Dylan bolted away from the cabin, her long, lean legs pumping toward the other end of the valley. The man trudged out from behind the black silhouettes of the trees that stood in front of Luke's vision like sensor bars. Though Dylan sprinted, and the man seemed to move in slow motion, he stayed directly behind her, as though she were running in place. Somehow his huge stride cut the distance between them easily. But she remained persistently out of reach. To his lumbering dismay, she was not wearing a long skirt he could trap beneath his boot.
Holy shit,
Luke whispered. Luke leaned left, still trying to see between the trees when Dylan and the man disappeared into darkness beyond the fire's light. The flames crackled. It was like they had walked off the edge of the map. No grunts rose into the sky. No screams hurtled through the forest. No sounds of snapping or sloshing through the brush reached Luke's ears. What the fuck was he supposed to do now? Every movement bloomed some new pain that shot through his entire body, immobilizing him. Still, Luke tried to push himself up. The sensation of 1,000 knives pricked into his leg, poking into the filled, bulbous skin like they were slicing into a water balloon. The jabs of pain reached all the way up his thigh, even a stray knife in the crook where his leg connected to his groin. The sensation was still crawling upward. Soon it would be eating at his belly, his chest, his heart. The thought made that organ pause. He pushed his good hand back against the trunk behind him, trying to balance himself on his working foot at the same time. But his foot slid against the soft ground, and the sharp bark shredded his palm. Still no screams from Dylan. No indication that the pair hadn't simply been swallowed whole by the earth when they moved out of the light of the fire. Luke pitched forward, rolling onto his stomach with a grunt of pain, and crawled. His good arm pulled against roots and thorned brambles, while his good foot dug into the clay and pushed, his bad arm and leg dragging, nerves firing warning shots across his entire body. As he neared the tree line, the full scene came into view. The fire, still digesting its meal, sizzled. The cabin's door stood open like a dropped jaw, a gaping mouth full of shadows.
Dylan,
he called, heaving breaths between each word.
Where are you? Can you hear me?
When no response came, he crawled forward. He remained inside the trees lining the valley, not wanting to stick his vulnerable torso into the light of the fire, offering himself up like a sacrifice. But maybe that would be best. At least he'd be put out of his misery. Like stepping on a half-crushed, still-twitching bug. The bandage on his arm frayed and unraveled as it scraped against the brush, catching burrs and vines, probably something poisonous that he'd pay for later. His wrist rolled beneath him. The hitching pain that should have accompanied it was masked by the larger agony screaming from his leg, the knives jabbing in and out. The whole thing consumed by a burning sensation, like the fire had spread to his skin, boiling whatever lay beneath the purple surface. He expected, at any moment, that a thorn or sharp rock would catch the bloat of his skin, popping the balloon. He didn't want to find out what would emerge. Something deep inside of him conjured an image of thick black tar. Finally, mercifully, his hand clasped around a fallen branch, solid and strong. He wrenched it out of the ground, half of it buried. With a heave, he pushed himself upright, the stick bending slightly under his weight when he fought to get his working foot underneath him. Finally, upright, he stumbled toward the cabin, the branch working as a makeshift crutch, the toes of his swollen foot dragging leaves out into the valley. He worked his way to the other side of the cabin, to the place where Dylan and the man had vanished. He moved more like the man, one clumsy step at a time, a sturdy stamp of the branch and then a hop, and with the same determination. But Luke aimed to save the damsel and not end her, not throw her to the flames that hissed and roared as he approached. The fire burped. It spat sparks, some flying so close that they singed his neck. Lying across the fire pit was a black silhouette, the vague shape of a body, toes pointing up. Singed wisps of white fabric, squares of her skirt bordered in black, littered the ground. The reeking scent of burning hair reached his nostrils, and he might have vomited if there had been anything left in his stomach to expel. When he breathed through his mouth to avoid the scent, he tasted her, a bitter, dry charcoal flavor that lingered at the back of his throat.
"What the fuck is this place?"
he whispered, forcing himself back into movement. What the fuck was he doing? How could he possibly help Dylan when he had 0 free limbs with which to fight? He stopped and took a deep breath. He had to at least try. The cabin blurred at the edges, as if it were a mirage, as if a hot layer of air stood between him and the structure. It mesmerized him, drew him closer, until he, too, touched its rough exterior. Solid wood. Even this close, the inside of the cabin was shrouded in darkness, the opening a dense mouth of nothingness. He hesitated, twisted his head left and right. The scene remained entirely still. He limped inside. The far side of the cabin was eaten by rock. A table was cut in half by it, 2 legs holding a flat top that disappeared into the wall. A climber's dream home, he thought, somewhat hysterically, bouldering in the kitchen. A half-finished meal sat on a plate, a thick slab coated in green-gray mold, some sort of rancid meat dotted with buzzing flies, like it had been sitting there for ages. His stomach gurgled at the meal, whether in hunger or disgust he was not sure. Luke scanned the room for a weapon, anything he could use to attack the man, to protect Dylan and himself. Next to the plate of rotten food stood a fork and bent spoon. On a bench lay a knife, the blade small and dull, just a couple of inches long. Nothing compared to the hatchet the man wielded, had buried into the woman's shoulder, the blade hacking through her bone like butter. But this tiny knife would have to do. There was nothing else. Luke stuck it in his waistband. He stumbled through the door before moving into the darkness on the other side of the cabin. It fell in front of him like a curtain, a hard border between the reach of the fire and the black forest. A single step into the darkness, and his skin prickled with goosebumps. The air here thin and cold, his breath clouding in front of his face. Here the trunks could not be distinguished from the gaps between them, and Luke's crutch knocked against them with a hollow thud. Every atom willed him to turn around.
"Dylan?" he called. "Where are you?"
Silence filled the space between his words.
Who am I kidding?
He thought, leaning against the thick branch.
I won't be able to catch up.
And even if he could, what was he going to do to stop that man, twice his size? Even if he didn't need this oversized stick to stand, even if his other hand were not strapped to his chest, what could he possibly do with the tiny knife he'd found?
Still, he thought, what else am I going to do?
He had to try, he decided. He couldn't just let Dylan be butchered. So he plunged farther into the darkness, deeper into the trees. His pupils widened, adjusted, and eventually he could see the trunks and where to move between them. With every step, he scanned for signs of Dylan or the man, for some ripped piece of fabric from Dylan's pants or jacket, small footprints engulfed by massive ones. But there was no sign of them, no sound from their chase, no movement in any direction that passed in his periphery. Behind him, the fire continued to digest its meal, the eerie snapping sound somehow reaching him still. He shimmied through the forest, each step more unbalanced, teetering over gnarled branches and the sticky, rotten pulp of poisonous fruit. The knives shooting into his swollen leg had penetrated to his bones, and each step brought a new fear that his swollen ankle would shatter, that he'd be left with nothing more than a sack of blood and pus and pain.
"Dylan!" he yelled. "Where the fuck did you go?"
Farther ahead, something glinted through the darkness, a little speck of light reflecting off of something shiny. He supposed it must be catching the farthest reaches of the fire somehow. No moon or stars hung in the sky. Maybe it was capturing Dylan's flashlight? He pushed ahead, following the shimmer. When he'd nearly reached the thing, the mysterious object set in the dark like bait, he hopped his good foot right into the curve of a root. He pitched forward, crashing into the mud. The tip of the little dull knife in his waistband nipped at his flesh. He lay in the dirt, more mud than fabric covering his body now, his teeth clamped shut, shuddering in adrenaline and agony. He wiped muck from his eyes. They adjusted again, pupils dilating into big round orbs. In front of him lay a tiny paw edged with gray-black fur. Slade! His breath hitched inside of him. His hand brushed through the fur, stiff and ice-cold. His fingers lingered against the dog's belly. His own breath paused while he waited for that reassuring expansion of Slade's chest. But the body was still, limp. The tears welled up, steaming against his cheeks. In that moment, Dylan and the man pursuing her disappeared, truly, into the darkness of the forest, not even a blip in his memory. Now he thought only of his dog, his precious Slade, the pup he'd rescued 3 years ago from a shelter. The dog who'd followed him from his campus-adjacent apartment back to his parents' house, and then to a rental with Dylan. Slade had never missed a crag trip. He'd snooze in the sun, dirt penetrating his undercoat, dusting his wet nose. But Luke had abandoned him, left him to wander into the maws of these woods, this fucked-up forest that conjured ghosts with blood-eating grins, that pushed you in maddening circles until you collapsed into a heap of muscles stretched like taffy, too tired to run anymore. What had it done to Slade? What terrors had he seen in his last moments? Luke wailed, the noise slicing through the silence, rising into the muddled sky. He nuzzled his nose into the thing's neck. He rocked back and forth with it, sobbing. Had he pulled himself away? Had he studied the face, the patterns of the fur? Had his brain not been scrambled with a concussion? He might have noticed that the nose was slightly longer than Slade's. Its hair was shorter, its ears not as perky. He might have realized that the edges of each hair were curiously blurred. He might have puzzled together that this was simply another trick, some clone for him to find. But in that moment, he only knew grief and howling pain. And so he held his not dog in his arms, pressing his face against the not ears, his fingers following the familiar instinct to rub little flecks of sleep out of the not eyes, an action he'd performed countless times before. Then something jabbed him, poked against his arm, just below the collar that hung around the thing's neck. Something blunt and hard and cold. Something meant for fingers to wrap around. A hilt. He screamed, his cry like a slaughtered goat, and squeezed the body against him. Someone killed Slade, he thought. Someone stabbed him. It had not been a dumb bear or coyote in need of a meal, or a mama deer kicking out to protect her young. It had been something with motive, something with intent, something that knew what it was doing, and did it anyway. He squeezed the hilt in his fist. It felt familiar in his hand. Then his fingers found the evidence. Along the side, an engraving sunk into the hilt, letters he'd watched being carved into it with his own Dremel tool. Dylan Prescott. A fire bubbled inside him. It pulsed through Luke's stomach and up through his chest. How could she have killed his dog? She knew how much he loved Slade. Had he been thinking straight? He might have wondered when Dylan would have had the time to plunge her knife into Slade's neck. After all, it had been in her hand when she'd exited stage left, pursued by a bear of a man into darkness. Had she really sprinted so far ahead of this ghost man, his stride the length of 10 steps, that she was able to not only find Slade, but lure him to her and stab? These thoughts were tiny specks at the bottom of his grief. If he had tried pulling the blade out, examined it, he would have discovered the lie. But his face flushed, his teeth chattered. Hot and blurring, tears flowed down his face, sending up tiny tendrils of steam into the cold night. Snot bubbled in his nostrils. For a moment, the heat of rage overrode the sting of the open wound on his arm, gathering dirt as the bandage unraveled. Even his leg had numbed. and he forgot that the purple was practically tickling his balls now. He squeezed the dog tight, kissing the top of its skull.
"I'm so sorry, Slade," he whispered. "I should have looked for you. I shouldn't have listened to her. I should have done everything I could to find you."
He couldn't make Slade come back, but he could make that bitch pay for what she'd done. He kissed the thing one last time, hugging it to his body. He covered it with a brushing of dirt, yet another shallow grave in the woods. Then he pushed himself back up onto the branch and plunged farther into the forest. He called out to Dylan, his voice echoing back to him, as if he had not discovered her crime, as if he were still the valiant boyfriend trying to rescue his girlfriend from the big bad man. The tiny blade he'd found in the shack burned at his side, his skin shriveling and searing in its heat.
"Dylan! Help me find you!" he yelled. "Tell me where you are! I found a weapon!"
Maybe the ghost had done it for him. Maybe she was already lying dead, mangled and bloody, somewhere in the woods. Or maybe the man's colossal hands were already wrapped around her ankles, dragging her toward the fire. Maybe they were around her neck. Maybe he was the last one left. March 13th, 2019, 10:37 p.m. Dylan's legs pounded beneath her, striking damp footprints into the ground. They moved on autopilot now, the muscles like a rubber band coiling and uncoiling, past the point of soreness or tiredness. Objects in motion, especially those being chased by hatchet-wielding ghost men, tend to remain in motion. Every few steps, she'd crane her head backward, sneaking a glimpse. The man stomped behind her. He somehow always hovered at arm's length, or a skirt's length, away, always ready to reach out with his enormous hands and crunch the bones of her ankles inside them. Her breath hitched, a stitch forming next to her rib cage. The chill in the air threatened to seize her lungs if she didn't stop soon, didn't slow down her greedy heart. When her foot slipped on wet leaves and her body shot forward, her heart got a small break, stopping completely in her chest, restarting only when the other boot landed and pushed away, her body upright and running still. She would not yet fall prey. But she couldn't keep up this bizarre cat-and-mouse routine forever. She'd surely already run a full marathon through the woods. How do you outrun someone, something, that never tired? She'd have to fight him. She'd have to get close enough that he could chop her to pieces. She couldn't keep running forever. Her knife remained clasped in her hand. The blade was folded, useless inside its housing. As she weaved between the trees, dodging trunks and low-hanging branches, she worked to open it. It fumbled in her hands while she coordinated her movements, trying to pinch the blunt side of the blade in the little cutout of the hilt. The tip poked its head out, a sharp little beak, but the rest of it remained stuck in the enclosure. Finally, with a wrench of her fingers, the length of the blade snicked free. Behind her, the man grunted and snapped branches beneath his boot, the wood sounding more and more like skeletons, like brittle breaking bones, and the image of those teenage bodies flashed behind her eyes. Then the gut-churning remains of Sylvia. Flesh flopped from Sylvia's ribcage. The image seared across her vision, and in this bloody haze, Dylan's foot found a root, kicking her toe right into the loop of it. Her body shot forward. As she fell, she gripped the hilt with one hand, not wanting it to go flying into the dark woods. She crashed into the ground, the blade snapping over her thumb. Blood gushed from her thumb, a lot of it, the digit trapped between the blade and its housing. It pulsed hot around her hand, overflowing like a pot of boiling water. Through the new, searing pain in her thumb, she managed to unhook her caught ankle, struggle upright, and continue running. She chanced to look behind her, wary of another root snatching at her ankles, but she had to know. She had to see where the man was, how much ground she had lost in her fumble. Oh shit, she thought. Is he going faster, or am I slowing down? He was definitely closer now, his boot immediately replacing the space her foot had just vacated. His grunt sounded clearer, and his swing of the hatchet seemed to miss her by centimeters. She even thought she could smell his decrepit breath, a mouthful of rotten, mossy teeth. Acid crept up her throat. The knife chopped her thumb like a bear trap, the blade notching her bone. Her blood left the entire thing so slippery she could barely hold on to it, let alone lift the blade out of her flesh while running. Her legs pumped on autopilot, her lungs numb. All of her pain had migrated to this single digit, had been replaced by the waterfall at the end of her hand. Fuck, she breathed. Fuck, fuck, fuck! On the wind, she heard something. Her name? Some syllables wove underneath the persistent grunting, the hot, huffing breath on the back of her neck. She desperately searched for the source. Could it be a rescuer? She picked out the first syllable, dill, and tripped again, spilling forward into the dirt. As she struck the ground, the knife bit more deeply into her thumb, close to severing it. She scrambled on hands and knees, her legs twitching beneath her, but her foot remained hooked into the loop of the root, which seemed to be constricting around her toes, receding into the earth. Still, the pain migrated, split itself between her thumb and twisted ankle. She could do nothing more than scream. With 2 oversized steps, the man straddled her. She finally unhooked her foot and tried to dart out from beneath him, but his fingers wrapped around her ankle, clamping tight, unyielding even as she flailed. With her free foot, she kicked at his hand, but he did not even grunt, as if he felt nothing at all. Her kicking foot was a mere annoyance, like a mosquito nibbling at his thigh. This was it. She'd be murdered by a hatchet-wielding ghost and thrown into a non-existent fire. Nobody would find her ashes. They'd disappear with everything else. No one would ever know what had happened here, what she'd accomplished before it all went to shit. Her name would disappear. At least she'd spare her family the expense of a funeral with nothing to bury. No, fuck that. She began working at the knife eating her thumb, ignoring the rocks and debris clawing at her back, tangling in her hair as the man dragged her through the woods. She pinpointed all of her attention on freeing the blade, sticky and slick with her blood. Her fingers slid away from it. Sharp, stabbing pain rocketed up her arm each time she got close to pinching the blade, to removing its teeth from her thumb. A glint of orange glowed through the trees. He was dragging her back to the fire. Then her own name rang through the trees, clear and close, louder. "Luke?" she yelled in response. "I'm over here! Help!" "Dylan, I'm coming as fast as I can," the voice replied. "I have a weapon." A voice spoke in her head. What if it's a trick? What if it's another trap? "Fuck it," she responded out loud. "I'm dead either way." With a roaring scream and a spurt of blood, she finally wrenched the steel blade from her thumb. The gash spat out buckets. She bent at the waist, climbing up her own leg, leaving a trail of wet, red splotches across her pants. Folded in half, her chin banging against her kneecap with each bounce of her bottom across the forest floor, she hacked away at the enormous hunk of flesh that was the man's hand. A line of dark, viscous fluid spilled down her arm, hot and thick as tar. How many times would she have to stab him for the fingers to release? She kept at it, unsure if any number of cuts would make a difference. He didn't seem to feel pain. Maybe she needed to saw them off, digit by digit. With each slice of her knife, more of the putrid pus emerged, and Dylan gagged, holding her breath against the foul, musty odor that stung the back of her throat. The fluid soaked into her pants, seeming to melt the acrylic fibers. When it found its way to her nearly decapitated thumb, it burned inside the wound, the pain so intense she nearly dropped her weapon. She swallowed bile and plunged the knife into his hand one last time and yanked it back out again. He roared, an inhuman wail like a wounded bear, and released her. She convinced her twisted ankle to bear weight and hobbled toward the sound of her name. "Where are you?" she yelled. "Over here." She pivoted toward the sound. Behind her, the apparition followed, stomping in the same steady cadence, both slowed by their respective wounds. "Luke?" she called.
Keep talking so I can find you.
After following the auditory breadcrumbs, she nearly crashed elbows first into Luke, who limped along with the help of a large branch. Even broken, resembling a scarecrow more than the man she'd entered the woods with just days ago, the sight of him warmed her, ebbed her pain. She was no longer alone. What the fuck was she thinking, going to explore a ghost cabin with a ghost murderer? She reached for an embrace, arms spread wide, but Luke brushed them away. "No time," he said, pulling a minuscule carving knife from his waistband, somehow still balanced upright. Together, they turned on the man bumbling in their direction, his eyes focused on Dylan. Whether because she was a woman, or because she was the one who'd sliced open his hand, she wasn't sure. They stood, ready, each of them shivering, their tiny blades against his hatchet large enough to fell a tree with 4 swings. "Stand by with your knife," Dylan whispered. "I'll distract him." Dylan stepped gingerly to the side. Luke shaded in darkness. The man shuffled to her, all eyes on her. Luke might as well have been invisible. When he reached Dylan, he towered over her small frame, somehow as wide and tall as 3 grown men. She jabbed her blade, all 3 inches of it, into his abdomen. The little wound dribbled more tar, inconsequential as a knee scraped against concrete. With his uninjured hand, he strangled Dylan. His hand was so huge his fingers touched at the back of her neck as he hoisted her into the air. The knife dropped from her hand, stabbing the dirt. Her feet dangled, kicking, while carbon dioxide became trapped in her lungs. She had to be 10 feet in the air. Her hands scratched at the green, rotten skin, trying to unpeel it from her larynx. "Luke!" she spat, a gravely hoarse noise. The edges of her vision blurred, spawned fuzzy darkness. This couldn't be the end. Luke would save her. Seconds later, her body dropped heavily to the dirt, landing on top of her injured ankle, twisting it further. A long, thin mark had appeared across the ghost's neck. Luke had somehow climbed onto the man's back and reached around with his knife. A cascade of thick, steaming tar poured from the wound, splashing onto their shoes. The stench adhered to the hairs in her nostrils, and she struggled to contain her vomit. The impossible man tipped forward, his knees buckling beneath him. The impact of his body shook the trees. Their branches rattled overhead, raining down bits of dried bark and dead twigs. Even in the darkness, Dylan's wide pupils couldn't mistake the image of his body dissolving into the muck. March 13th, 2019, 11:57 p.m. Luke tightened his grip around his knife, the edge somehow already rusted and corroded from the impossible man's tar blood. He sucked in fresh, cold air, his heart pounding inside his skeleton, pumping around the last dregs of adrenaline. The spot where the man had melted held a dark puddle that they both kept their distance from. At least he, whatever he was, a ghost, an entity, was gone. In the distance, the woman screamed, the same shrill sound they'd heard when they first encountered the cabin, as if they hadn't killed the man, but had merely transported him back there. The deadly scene looping over to the start. The adrenaline finally ebbed, and Luke's rage filtered back in. Dylan's knife in Slade's cold fur. Luke ground his teeth. Dylan limped to Luke, moving behind a tree to avoid the pool. "Thank God I heard you," she said. "I twisted my ankle on a root. I don't know how much longer I could have kept running. You saved me." "Yeah," Luke said, his fingers sweating around the wooden hilt of his knife. "That was fucking crazy," she said, wrapping her arms around him, leaning her head on his shoulder. The putrid scent of tar and blood on her made him gag. The knife twitched in his hand. She was so close. He could plunge the thing into her neck in one swift motion. "Let's figure out how to get the fuck out of here." "Why did you kill Slade?" He had to know. "What?" she asked, lifting her head. She limped back, out of easy reach. "What are you talking about?" "I found him.
his body.
Oh my God, Luke, I'm so sorry. She stepped closer, preparing for another embrace that Luke could not stomach. He preempted her touch by asking,
Then why did you kill him?
Luke, I didn't kill Slade, she replied. I'm really sorry that you found him like that you found his body. But it wasn't me.
I know you did it, he sneered.
The wooden hilt burned against his palm.
I found your knife in his neck.
What are you talking about? My knife is right here. She held out her empty hand covered in crusted blood, a small river still pulsing out of her thumb. Shit, she said, ripping a strip of fabric from her shirt to wrap around her wound. The makeshift bandage licked up the blood, and she winced and gritted her teeth as she wrapped it.
You can't find it, because it's inside his body, Luke said.
Luke, I swear, I didn't kill Slade. She limped over to the space where she had grappled with the man, toeing around the edge of the rancid puddle. I just had my knife a moment ago. I had it just now. You saw me with it. I used it to stab that man, that thing.
Don't lie to me, he said.
Leaning his weight on the branch crutch, he hobbled back toward the shallow grave he'd created for Slade. It was so much closer to the tree line than it should have been, but he didn't spare a thought to that anomaly. The daggers of pain inside his leg had faded, replaced by the taut, burning rage in his chest. Dylan dropped to her knees, swiping her hands through the brush, as if hoping her fingertips would graze against the cold hilt of her knife. She did not appear to care if they dipped into the rancid puddle, or if she'd smack the meat of her palm right into the open blade.
You and I both know the knife isn't there. It's in Slade's neck, he said. I didn't just see Slade. I felt him. I held his cold body against mine. Can you even imagine what that's like? To find someone you love dead, murdered like that? Cold? Limp?
I'm sorry that you found Slade like that, she said, but you have to listen to me. I don't know what you found or saw, but it wasn't my knife in Slade's neck. It might not have even been Slade.
He brushed dirt away from the body. Here's the evidence. You probably didn't think I'd ever find him, that I'd feel your name carved into the weapon buried in his fur.
She stared, mouth open at the cold body. Luke, that's not Slade, she said.
Don't you think I'd know my own fucking dog?
I don't know where that dog came from, but it's not Slade, she said, her voice pitching higher, the words stringing together in desperation. She really wanted him to believe this bullshit. Trick him into thinking he couldn't recognize the dog he'd raised from a puppy.
Don't lie to me, he said.
Luke, look. Slade had that whale-shaped marking along his neck, right? Where is it? It's not on this dog. And the ears are wrong. Slade's were pointy and these are floppy. It's not him. The hilt of the knife pressed splinters into his palm. He growled. Luke, please, she said. Whatever that is, there's something wrong with this place. It's making us see things. It could be another one of those things for all we know. Another ghost or something? Didn't Clay say he saw a weird dog on the trail? Didn't you see one yourself that first night? She backed away from him, from the evidence of her deed, shuffling farther into the trees. He pushed toward her, not even bothering to skirt around the puddle. The foul substance kicked up, soaking into his pants, into the makeshift gauze hugging his ankle. He barely even felt the burn of it. With one quick slash of his knife, he destroyed the sling holding his other arm hostage. He no longer cared whether it ached. The steel glinted in some ghostly light when he transferred it to this newly freed hand. His vision became a pinhole, all his energy pulsing and aiming at one thing. He could not rest until he did it. He shambled toward her, faster now that he could better grip the crutch. She scrambled backward on her hands, her back pushing up against a tree, Luke a double of the ghost they'd just slain. Before he could get close enough to slash at her, to slice a neat line across her neck, She stood and stepped backward, one foot steady and the wounded one timid. He sliced the knife across thin air, still too fucking far away, even at the edge of his reach. He was moving too slowly. He placed the slightest bit of weight on his bad leg, the one now completely swollen and purple and rotting, the one that should have incapacitated him with the pain of 1,000 knives at the slightest touch. But it had numbed beneath the waves of rage. He sliced its sling away, too.
I held him in my arms, he roared. I thought you loved him, too. I never thought you'd hurt him. You killed him that first night, didn't you? You let him out of the tent on purpose.
Luke, please, she said.
He lunged at her, the knife swiping inches from her nose. Hot, burning rage rose up through the ground, into his feet with each step, boiling his insides. Dylan's mouth moved, but a sharp buzzing filled his ears, like the swarm of flies had returned and filled the space inside his skull. His entire body thrummed with red tension, each muscle and tendon taut, his breath slow and loud and grunting. His heart beat as if locked inside a vice, and release would only come after he avenged Slade. Luke moved slowly, but Dylan's ankle was wounded. She bobbed through the trees, favoring her left side. But she could pivot and make sudden turns, zigzagging through the trees while he scraped behind on his makeshift crutch. He couldn't lose her. Ahead, the trees opened. The fire blazed beyond them, the orange flicking wild behind the silhouette of the cabin. She turned in front of him, a hard right into denser woods. Luke grunted and changed his trajectory.
You can't run forever, he growled.
Her feet did not stop pedaling away, just out of reach, until she reached another clearing in the trees, the trunks thinning like hair. She paused at the sight of those ghoulish teens, the ones that had surrounded Sylvia's corpse, now huddled in a circle, their heads down and bobbing. Each one on their knees, fighting over something, slurping. A scream boiled out of Dylan's throat, and their heads rose, their eyes beady and yellow above their maws matted with muck. They smiled at Luke, their teeth full of sinew. He smiled back. He'd give them another meal soon enough. Another orange glow erupted ahead, more flames, spreading in a line as if following a path of gasoline. Luke grinned. A trap waiting, wide enough that Dylan could not change course to avoid it, could not switch directions before it encircled them, leaving her unable to do anything but face him, without a weapon. "Fuck," she said. For a moment, Luke thought she might try to cross through the ring of fire, leaving her scalded, but not dead. Luke needed her dead. She pressed forward, closer to the flames, considering. The air grew thick as honey, steam rising from the mud, from the ground that had just been frozen. Every pore on his body evaporated sweat, expelling the little water he'd swallowed in the last 24 hours. It felt like swimming, drowning. His blood seemed to boil, bubbling against his reddening skin, until he felt he was actually cooking, his muscles browning and stiffening like a flank steak on a grill. Luke squinted through the smoke, his retinas dry in their sockets. A sulphurous cloud shrouded the face of a figure behind the flames. Light winked against his chest, shimmering gold pinned against slate felt. The figure, the man in the slate-gray uniform, nodded at him, motioned for him to proceed. When the man opened his mouth in a pleasured snarl, the red-orange light reflected off his saliva, his teeth glowing. Dylan coughed in the smoke, now backing away from the flames. Luke laughed, the sound thick and distorted. He had her. "Fuck me," Dylan said, twisting around, following the ring of flames to its inevitable conclusion. To Luke. Luke grinned. Everything inside of him, every atom of his being compelled him, urged him with screaming fury to complete the task, to avenge his beloved dog. He could not rest until it was done. Everything vibrated, hovered in the margins of his vision. The flames, the dark forest around them, the ringleader standing on the other side of the fire, somehow putting messages inside his head. Keep moving. Do it. He'd been given a clear chance. Dylan stood, clutching her ruined thumb to her chest, wobbling on her feet. He laughed at this easy target. Even with his bad leg and sore wrist, this should be quick. He held the only weapon. "Luke, please," she said. He growled and lunged the blade at her, but it sliced only through the smoke. She'd jumped out of the way. The pair danced, an unbalanced interpretive cat and mouse, as if they were performing ballet with weights and chains strapped to their feet. Even in this small arena, she evaded his blade, hopping out of reach. "Stop running, you bitch!" Luke snarled. The walls of flame pushed inward, licking up the grass and brush in their path. The fire burned their backs, and they both stepped closer, their dance becoming more intimate. Beneath the smoke, he could smell her, the rank scent of blood and sweat and grime and ghostly pus. He stabbed at her once more, the blade catching skin, leaving a dark line of blood at her shoulder. "I've got you," he said. More glistening teeth appeared behind the flames, urging him on. Make her bleed. The fiery ring grew smaller still. No more wiggle room for her to dodge. Above the shrinking ring stood a knobby branch, and Dylan abandoned the dance and threw her arms at the bark, doing what she did best. Climbing. "That's cute," Luke said, grinning. In one crooked step, he stood under her, wrapping his fingers around her ankle, squeezing and dragging her back down. She kicked at him with her other leg, and he plunged the blade into her calf as far as it would go. She wailed, sharp like the last bleat of a slaughtered goat. Her hands unclenched from the branch, her body flopping into the dirt. Now she lay prone beneath him, her face against the wet leaves. He could end it quickly, if he picked the right spot for the tiny knife, if he did it before she twisted or fought. Then he could release the tension that choked his breath, that pulled at his tendons like marionette strings. He needed her to die. Only then would everything inside of him relax. Her neck glistened with sweat, the skin soft and thin. An artery pulsed there, a big one, and he dropped her ankle and bent over her neck, the faint purple beneath. He lowered the knife, sharp and swift. But instead of the resistance of flesh, it landed in dirt. She had somehow twisted beneath him, that little bitch, had dodged the blade. Now, her face, smeared with mud, stared at his, teeth gritted and brows clenched. He lowered his weight on her, his forearm against her collar, and plucked the knife out of the ground, poised again to plunge it into her neck. But her hand caught his wrist, her fingers strong and unbudging. They tussled in the dwindling ring, her climbing muscles fighting against his weight. This was supposed to be the easy part. The blade was so close to her neck. But she had always been the stronger of the two, always pushed harder in the gym and on the walls, could do 10 pull-ups for every 3 he completed. He pressed all of his weight into his hand, into pushing the blade down, but her arm locked in place. Her hand gripped so tight around his wrist that blood pooled on either end. His fingers tingled with numbness. Now she grinned. March 14th, 2019, 1:13 a.m. Dylan squeezed Luke's wrist until her knuckles went pale, until the pain of it wrinkled her forehead, until she could feel the cracking of the little cylindrical bones beneath his skin. He still strained to lower the blade. While she crushed the bones in his wrist, she bent her knee, working to wedge her leg between their bodies. All of his focus stayed on his plunging, wilting wrist, and he didn't notice what she'd done until her knee jabbed into the bottom of his rib cage. Maintaining her killer grip on his wrist, she dug her knee into his chest and lifted him away, enough for her to plant her foot on the middle of his chest. The tendons in her fingers tingled. Every inch of her sagged with exhaustion, her eyelids heavy, her skin sticky and gritty with sweat and dirt. She inhaled, pushing every little bit of energy she had left into her foot, still clenching his wrist, pushing up until her knee locked out, her leg forming a straight line. A distinct pop rang into the air. It was the sound of tendons tearing and joints misaligning, loud even over the crackling of the fire. Luke released the knife with a cry of pain, and it sliced a fine line across her cheek as it fell. The rusty steel, tacky with tar blood, burned as it cut, leaving an irritated, splotchy welt. The sting pulsed down her face into her nose and lips, as if it had already infected her. Now, he lay on the ground, trying to push himself upright on broken wrists, one swollen and one limp, his hands flopping like grounded fish. The knife lay next to Dylan. She didn't want to get up. Even if she made it past this trial, if she got away from Luke, she knew this meant killing him. But she couldn't bring herself to imagine that she could plunge this knife into his flesh enough times and in the right places. Even if she made it out of here, she'd still have the fire and the ghosts to contend with. And even after that, the fucked-up looping forest, and now probably some unknown bacteria in her wound cheek that would kill her anyway. But what could she fucking do? Give up this close to the end? Luke nearly to his feet, she grabbed the knife and held it in front of her. A warning. She didn't intend to return his favor. "Luke, please," she said, struggling upright. The fire pulsed at her back. "Don't come closer. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." His ankle bones cracking and swollen skin darkening, he stumbled toward her, still intending to finish the deed, even without his weapon, even with his mangled hands. She could only stand in the center of the ring, the blade between her and her boyfriend who wanted to kill her, while he lumbered like a zombie in her direction. The flames licked at her back, and she felt herself shrinking inside her coat. Her knees wobbled under her body barely able to stand from dehydration and exertion. Tears welled in her eyes, the last speck of water in her, blurring her vision, painting her possessed boyfriend in watercolor. But somehow it still wasn't over. Not yet. He still moved toward her, propelled not by the fire but by his own rage, his face sweltering in both. "How is this supposed to work, Luke?" she asked, her voice cracking. The blade shook in her fingers. "How are you going to win this? I've got the knife. What's your plan? Your hands are too fucked up to strangle me. You might as well just wait for the fire to take us both." He showed no signs of recognition, of having heard even a single word of her plea. He moved like something out of control. The tears that poured from her eyes when she was forced to plunge the blade into him left a hard, cold pain in her chest. A pain that grew when she plunged again, left with no choice but to shed his blood into the hungry earth. The knife dropped to Dylan's side, dripping with her boyfriend's blood. Below her, Luke lay still, eyes wide and bulging, mouth agape. "Dylan," he said. His wide eyes found her. No longer possessed, still bleeding out, he reached up toward her, and she took his useless hand. "I'm sorry, Luke," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I should have never agreed to come here. We should have gone to look for Slade." His hand squeezed hers. Then his eyes became orbs of glass, nothing more. The ring of fire dwindled around her, the flames extinguishing into a smoky haze that left her coughing, left her huddled close to the ground, soaking in her boyfriend's hot blood and holding his cold hand, waiting for the smoke to rise up into the trees. She folded into herself, pulling her knees to her chest. The tears that emerged dissolved into steam. What had happened? How had she become the final one left here, in this despicable place? How had it come to a point that she had to murder her own boyfriend? Could she have saved him? Would one single stab have broken the trance? She considered the knife next to her. That maybe it would be better to end it now than to fight anymore, than to outrun more ghosts or fire or poison, or whatever else this fucked-up valley might hold.
blood and tar gummed the short blade. She knew it would hurt. It would not be quick. She couldn't do it, she decided. She couldn't let this fucking place win. Not in that way. It had had enough victories. It would have to work harder for this last one. The smoke finally cleared, leaving a ring of scorched earth around her. A charcoal scent lingered, something she'd always associated with friends and climbing, with good times and marshmallows and stars and hot dogs. But she would, for the rest of her life, associate this scent with this place, with Luke's death. The carbon burned the back of her throat like a cigarette. The air hung quiet. No sound at all. No birds, no wind, no crunching of leaves. No more screams. The dark cold of mid-March returned, seeped into the ground, into her clothes, and she shivered, all of the sweat and fear and blood hardening into pellets of ice along her skin. Her base layer, a thin polyester shirt, fused to her back. She wondered if she would fare better if she stripped down to nothing, if the chill of the night air would be less painful than the trapped ice beneath her jacket. In little clouds, her breath pooled in front of her. She sat up, leaning against a tree, the sheet of ice cracking against the trunk. She didn't move for what felt like hours, a whole millennium. Her eyes glazed, squeezing out stray tears. She lolled her head against the bark, considering the knife again, waiting for the ghosts or demons or the elements to take her, for the earth to slurp her down whole, to peel her meat off her bones like it had done to Sylvia. "What are you fucking waiting for?" she screamed. How had everything gone so wrong? Just 5 days ago, she thought she was going to be a famous climber with Petzl making her their star. More brands clamoring at the chance to sign her, throwing increasing sums of money at her, plastering her face onto magazine covers and her voice onto podcasts. She was supposed to be the girl who developed a new crag, who conquered the rock first. So how did she end up here, next to the cooling corpse of her boyfriend? How did she end up the final girl, the last one breathing? Behind her in the trees, the ghosts gathered. Their yellow eyes glowed in the darkness. They licked their lips, considering Luke's body. They'd had a taste of his blood, already soaked into the hungry earth, into the valley to which they were chained, inexplicably and forever linked. Now they waited for his flesh. After picnicking on Clay's innards, they were nearly full. Something jittered at her hip, a familiar buzzing that sang a sharp melody. She mistook it for a shiver, barely registering the noise as anything but her own clattering teeth, until it happened again. Inside her clothing, her phone screeched. She patted her pocket and pulled it out. She hadn't remembered still having it, let alone shutting off the mode that should have blocked any battery-draining notifications. The thing continued to vibrate in her hand, text messages and notifications from Instagram stacking up on her screen. But beyond the stylized square icon in the corner, the text was a garbled mess of overlapping letters, dots, and symbols she didn't recognize. Everything a bunch of nonsense. The phone must be glitching. Maybe the fire had warped it somehow, or her sweat had snaked its way inside to corrode the computer chips. She cautiously checked the top corner, holding her breath. One single bar. She clicked one of the distorted notifications, opening the app. Her heart beat a drumline in her chest. Her hands trembled, and she worried that the movement would shift the receptors out of place, just enough to lose the signal. When the app opened, the screen displayed more of the same. Text stacked so many times it created a black bar of babble. Pixelated images that would not load further, that were so blurry the colors bled together. More strange symbols, like an alien language. But it didn't matter. By this point, everything was simple muscle memory for Dylan. She clicked around, knowing exactly which part of the screen would create a new post, would make a story that would disappear within 24 hours. She wasn't sure she had even that much time.
Her final cry for help would surely outlive her.
Even the clock in the corner of the screen was broken, displaying a time that did not exist, 65:67. But it must be night or early morning. The sun hadn't risen yet. At least not here. Maybe outside of this cursed valley, the sun shone, and it was a glorious afternoon for the rest of the population in Livingston, Kentucky. She started a live video. She wasn't sure anyone would be online, would log on to watch her stream, but something began to populate on the screen where usernames of viewers usually appeared, where comments would pop up. But it was just more of those symbols.
"If there's anyone out there seeing this," she said, "please contact the authorities in Livingston, Kentucky. Something bad has happened. I'm the only one left." More tears welled, hot in the corners of her eyes. In the screen, everything was bathed in blurry gray. "I don't know exactly where we are. I don't know the specific coordinates or anything. Sylvia had those. We had a GPS thing, but it broke. We're back in the woods, down a hill. I think we came in off Route 490. I can't find the way out. I twisted my ankle. I need help. Please send help." Words fell out of her mouth like vomit, as if she needed only to say the correct set of them to get home. She rambled as more crazed symbols accumulated across the bottom of the screen. She clicked the button she knew would flip the camera. It had been pointing at the dark dirt in front of her. The sight of her own face, even muted in the darkness, stole the sentences from her throat. Dried blood dripped out of the scratch on her cheek, a raised welt. Snot pooled in her nostrils, caked her bottom lip. Even in the darkness, every little capillary inside her eyes was highlighted, redness obscuring the whites. Her hair plastered to her cheeks, curving and branching like veins, like bare trees. "Please," she said into the camera lens. "There's something here. Ghosts, I don't know. I know that sounds crazy. Maybe I am crazy, but I swear there's—" For the second time, her thoughts died in her mouth. In the corner of the screen, behind her own face, behind the tree she leaned against, there was another face. One with yellow eyes and dripping teeth. Holding the phone steady, she twisted her head backward, craning her neck to see around the trunk. She held her breath, not wanting the tiny clouds to conceal the view. She froze, blinking. She waited for her eyes to adjust from the brightness of the screen back to the darkness, but even when her pupils dilated, she found only the trunks of more trees behind her. Maybe I really am crazy. But back on the screen, it was there, and it was smiling. "Do you see that?" she asked, more rambling to fill the feed, a gut reaction to streaming live. "Do you see that face right there? Right over my shoulder? In the top right corner?" She turned her head backward again, swiveling it in slow motion, as if sudden movement would spook the ghost into action. Still, nothing sat in her line of sight but the dark silhouettes of trees. When she moved her head back to the screen, the ghost was right behind her. The man with the slate-gray jacket, regalia like a general. He set his hand on her shoulder. The cold weight of it settled there. The blackened fingertips and gray, rotting knuckles only registered on her screen. The flurry of comments picked up their pace, still unreadable. She recoiled, her entire body shrinking from his touch, nearly dropping the phone. Pain throbbed through her swelling ankle as she scrambled up and away, limping and much too slow. Dylan held the screen out in front of her, a lens into the other world. Behind her, more of them poured from the trees, descending on Luke. The men with rough cotton shirts and twin voids in the center of their faces plucked out her boyfriend's eyes and popped them into their mouths like gumballs. One of the teens in the windbreakers picked the knife out of the dirt and chopped off his toes, passing each one around the circle. The man in the slate gray remained behind her, too close, though it looked like his feet were stationary, as if he were floating toward her. In the top corner of the phone, signal bars stacked on top of each other, the jumbled text resolved itself, and at last she could read the comments. "Is this for real?
What's going on? Where are you?" She should have expected what happened next. At the moment her phone lit up with full signal, the screen went black. The battery died. March 14th, 2019, 7:29 a.m. Hours later, Dylan still gripped the dead phone in her hand. She'd kept running after it had shut off, slowing to a walk only once she'd spun around and discovered she was alone. Her ankle throbbed beneath her, and the layer of ice at her back had melted, again, into stinking sweat and coppery blood. She'd wandered, directionless, through the woods for hours, until she simply dropped where she stood, massaging her ankle, ears perked for any more surprises this place might have in store. Now, the sky tinted orange. The sun eroded the dark, and for a second, her reflection in the phone's screen made her jump, thinking it had somehow turned back on. Before she could study the purple-gray pools of baggy skin underneath her eyes, or the splatter of Luke's blood against her chin, or the raised slash across her cheek, she launched the phone as far as she could into the woods. She screeched, a primal release, before the tears returned. The thin warmth of the new day's sunlight thawed her bones. For a moment, her chest unhitched, her muscles relaxed. Her heart beat at half speed. In all directions, the spaces between the trees filled with light. No more sneaky, crawling things could hide in the night. But she was still trapped here, in this damned valley, and now she was alone. She had done that to herself. In this moment of stillness, an image of Sylvia surfaced. Something Dylan had seen the night before, but not processed until now. The back of Sylvia's body, the part that touched the ground, had been gone. The flesh had dissolved somehow. And then the image moved. A chunk of flesh from Sylvia's midsection plopped into the dirt and sank down as if the ground were quicksand. Her ankle twitched, little needles poking the swollen muscle. And then Luke replaced Sylvia in her head, lumbering toward her, dead-eyed like a zombie wanting her brains. Again she felt the little blade plunging into his soft flesh until it hit some tendon or bone that the rusty dull blade could not counter. Again she saw the recognition return to his face. The Luke she had known and lived with for 2 years come back. His body fell to the ground again, a slow-mo replay, left there to harden into rigor mortis. Or he would have, perhaps, if the ghosts hadn't come to eat their dessert. She vomited, spitting up acid that eroded her esophagus. No more foraged food left to expel. Her hands were stained with his blood. Her blood. The blood of countless strangers. She didn't dare look at what lay beyond her waist, what stain remained from that blood pond. She held her hands up to the light, the first time in hours that they were clearly visible. Blood coated them like she'd dipped her hand into a bucket of paint, so complete that only an imprint of the knife's hilt remained unblemished. The red cracked along her knuckles, around her destroyed thumb that burst with pain when she rediscovered it. Her entire body yearned for sleep, her limbs sore and her head heavy. Her mind ached to rid itself of intrusive thoughts. The brush beneath her seemed soft, and she gave serious consideration to lying down, closing her eyes and leaving herself to her fate. But the bitter scent of her vomit stung in her nostrils, miming the metallic taste in her mouth. Her stomach grumbled. She wished she had some water, a corner of a granola bar, anything to quiet her body. Where had the creek been? Where was their campsite? Trees stretched in every direction, their limbs carrying spring buds. Through their branches, she spotted the rock face. She exhaled a sharp breath and pushed herself to her feet. The cylinder of granite burst out of the ground like a geyser, trees surrounding it like a halo. It seemed to be the same distance from her now as when she had first caught a glimpse of it on their way in. She considered turning around, heading away from the wall in a straight line, hoping for the road, making sure the rock always stayed right behind her. But opposite the rock wall was a line of endless trees with pink sky poking through their veiny branches. "Maybe I've ended up on the backside of the rock face," she said. Behind her could be trees for countless miles. Fuck it. She chose the rock. Chose to move toward the familiar terror rather than the unknowable one. She'd had enough of the unknowable for the time being. At least at the rock, she'd be at home. She knew what to do with the wall, knew herself when she climbed it. She had full control. She plodded toward it, her ankle throbbing more and more with each step, the adrenaline waning inside her veins. She wished she would stumble upon the thick branch Luke had been using as a crutch, the thought of his name sending pangs rippling through her chest. The silence pressed against her ears. Even her boots stamping through the leaves did not create a crunch. Twigs split in half, but did not snap. Instead, her boots pressed plant matter into the wet ground like moldy slush, like she was walking across a sponge. "That's odd," she said, breaking the silence. A horrified giggle gurgled from her lips with sudden realization. "There hasn't been any rain since we've been here. Why is the ground muddy?" Still, she refused to look down, not wanting to determine whether it was truly simply wet ground or whether it was another puddle of blood. If she had looked beyond the dark red stains that reached her thighs, she would have discovered only plain forest floor. The wet came from beneath. The earth was nearly full, but it still salivated. Instead, she kept her eyes up, always pointed at the wall ahead, as if it would disappear from view and pop up behind her if she so much as blinked. She honed in on every pain, every minuscule twinge in her ankle, the stream of blood still pumping from her thumb, the twitch at the corner of her eye, the burning gash along her face. It meant she was still here, and it erased the images, the corpses that wormed their way into her head. Each time Sylvia's white ribcage or Luke's chewy eyeball presented itself in her mind's eye, she stamped hard with her swollen ankle, and one type of pain ate away at the other. After what seemed like hours, the sun pushing up into the sky all the while, she reached the wall. The electricity of it hummed in her ears, a high frequency she imagined was just for her. She reached toward it, knowing it would consume her. It would demolish all other thoughts. It would be her body and the wall. But she dropped her hand to her side, her fingernails slicing crescents into her unmarred palm. She knew she would not be able to let go once she touched it. It took all of her willpower to back up, to stay 3 full feet away from it. She followed the wall. Around the curve lay their campsite, where the tents still stood, 3 polyester pyramids in a row, visible once more. Their contents lay scattered, as if the tents had exploded, as if someone had been looking for something, or someone. The cabin was gone, the petrified wood foundation they had discovered days ago, glinting innocuously in the sunlight. She gave no response, felt no wide-eyed alarm. She merely picked through the debris for a new set of clothing that was not stained with blood or soaked in muck or sweat. Something clean and untouched. She peeled each layer from herself like a bandage, the fabric practically fused to her skin. She stripped in plain sight, too afraid to discover what might appear if she entered the liminal concealing space of the tent. But even the fresh pair of clothes could not remove the layer of dried, sticky sweat, or the blood on her hands. Nothing to do about that. Now what? She wondered. The valley lay in deep silence. Nothing moved. No yellow eyes or teeth lingered inside the tree line. No crazed husbands came for their wives. No resurrected teens waited to slice open skin with rusty beer can blades. Black ash spilled out of the fire pit and across the grass. The fire that had seemed to light the whole valley ablaze somehow extinguished.
But if she perked her ears, if she closed her eyes and listened, she could hear the passing rush of rubber on asphalt. Or was that in her head? She sat at the fire pit, on top of a stray sweatshirt on one of the unripped camping chairs. It was one of Luke's, emblazoned with a cheesy, grinning cartoon man with flowing blonde hair from Miguel's, the pizza joint at Red River Gorge where they'd met. The same day she'd sent her first 513. The grinning cartoon broke her. Fat tears she couldn't afford to shed spilled from her eyes. Her hands trembled in her lap. She'd probably never see that place again, the place that held so much of her blood and calloused skin and sweat, the place where she had found herself. When her body could not expend another bead of water, the pangs of grief moved to her skeleton, every bone seeming to ache. The sun lifted in the sky, finally breaking past the tree barrier, and the air warmed. The heat loosened her muscles, countering the dull ache inside of her, a waning cocktail of adrenaline and swollen, sore joints. The light caught something else, a glimmer against glass, a blinding glitter that wouldn't let her ignore it, like a laser pointed directly at her eye socket. "Fine," she said. "I'll do what you want. I'll go look at this thing. What else am I going to do?" She followed the glaring breadcrumbs to a phone. It must have been Sylvia's or Clay's, she reckoned, since the screen wasn't destroyed. Clicking it on, she scanned the corner. No bars, and it was password protected. For the hell of it, she clicked the emergency call option, but the call didn't connect. She launched the phone with her unhurt hand, sending it slamming into the rock wall. She did exactly what the valley wanted. It dragged her close enough to the wall to ensnare her, to send out its invisible tendrils to rope her in. Static spat out a spark that licked her finger when she reached to touch the rock. The spark jolted her, overriding the nagging thought in her head that said, "Do not climb this wall." But she touched it, and then it was over. She would climb. She started up the wall. Taut exhaustion filled every sinew, every muscle, every tendon, all stretched and ready to break. Her ankle throbbed with every movement, every toe hold, every time she pushed her weight onto it. Her destroyed thumb left the granite sticky. She didn't flinch when her toes pressed into the very tips of her boots. It felt like home. The wall was cool and dry. She worked the problem, ascending. She stuck her fingers into a tiny pocket, catching spider webs. Lucky that the ruined digit was her thumb, not much utilized in climbing. Her feet slipped away from the wall, and she clung with the skin of her fingertips. She would not fall. She would not let herself. She would not let this place win. At least, she would fight it like hell. She'd go out on her terms. The heat from the sun seared her forehead as she neared the top, now within reach. 5 inches from topping out, from her body spilling over the lip of the root, she reached up, hooking onto the ledge. An easy jug, a wide, curved handle. No effort at all. She grinned. It was almost over. She threw her other hand on the hold, rounded like a ladder rung. She readied her feet. One more high foot hook, and she'd be over the top. She would live. Surely no ghosts would be able to reach her up here. Surely she could signal someone, a passing helicopter. There must be people looking for them by now. She exhaled, celebrated for 1 single second before hoisting her foot up to the next hold. From her vantage point, the stretches of Kentucky forest spread out around her, a sea of budding trees. She'd done something other climbers spent their entire careers training for. Not once, but twice. And with a swollen ankle and destroyed thumb, with a body empty of food and water, without even climbing shoes. Even if nobody else would ever know, this fucking valley couldn't take away the fact that she climbed this rock. Sent it on her first try, with no ropes, no safety. This fucking place took everything from her.
her career, her friends, her boyfriend. But it couldn't take this. One last throw to her hand over the top, and her fingers landed in grooves of skin. In someone else's hand. It squeezed hers. A warm, familiar squeeze she'd recognize even in complete darkness. Luke. Haloed by the morning sunlight, he somehow stood at the top of the rock, pulling her up and over the edge. How could he be here? Was this another hallucination? "Let me help you," he said, the voice soft and angelic. "It's almost over." She squeezed back and pushed up with her toes. He'd been himself in his last moments. Maybe he had escaped. Maybe he wasn't dead after all. Maybe he'd made it up before her. He was a decent climber, too. No, it didn't make sense. It was a trick. Her head crested the ledge of the granite, and it became clear. She was never going to make it out alive. This place, whatever it was, had lured her up here. Just wanted to see her try. Make her hope. Behind Luke's face were all the others. The ghostly dinner party from the trees, the eyeless men, the soldiers, the teenagers in their garish coats, the woman and her dead baby. Even the dog Luke had thought was Slade. Clay and Sylvia were there, too. Flesh hung like ribbons away from Sylvia's bones, half her face missing. Clay's intestines spooled out the front of him, his rib cage open like a cabinet. No longer in silhouette, Luke was missing his eyes and toes, had blood pouring from his mouth. 2 stab wounds in his chest. She'd put them there. The hungry ghosts licked their lips. Luke. Not Luke. This is not the person I loved. Pulled again. Now squeezing so hard her fingers turned white, the bones in her wrist rattling beneath her skin. She braced her feet against the rock. She would not be pulled over the edge, to the top of the wall, just to be feasted upon. She'd heard Clay's agonized screams ringing through the woods. The aftermath of Sylvia's day-old rotten flesh was seared into her mind. She'd seen Luke's eyes and toes eaten like candies, like delicacies. Fuck that. When she pushed against the rock with her feet, it cracked. A chunk slid away, broke off the wall entirely, falling with her. Her hand slipped out of Luke's, out of whatever he had become. There was nothing for her to reach out for, no last-minute deus ex machina thing to grab onto. She would fall to her death. At least it would be on her terms. Maybe she'd escape the fate of her fellow campers. Maybe not. But she refused to let this fucking place win. For a moment, she glimpsed the spot where the chunk had broken away, a moment that stretched and extended. The rock bled. It gushed like a waterfall, as if she'd injured it. Good, she thought. She dropped through open air. Starting at the point of injury, the waterfall eroded the pillar around it, cracks extending like lightning across the structure. The entire thing collapsed, swallowed back into the earth, taking her with it. In the aftermath, the air hung still. Dust settled. No more rock, only Kentucky sky. April 2019. Tabitha hadn't heard an update from Clay since he left. No social media posts, no emails, no texts. He'd promised to send word about their findings when they ventured back into town to resupply. But it had been weeks, and he'd ghosted. Maybe he'd gotten so caught up in the research that the group hadn't left the site yet, or had only sent out one person to retrieve more food and supplies. Maybe something went wrong with the study, and he hadn't been able to go, or it had been cut short, and he didn't text because he was embarrassed. She mulled over these flimsy excuses. But they didn't fit. Something nagged at her, like a hand pulling at her pant leg. Had she misremembered the date they were leaving? She tried texting him, but never received a reply. He'd gotten caught up in studies before, but he'd never gone this long without some type of response. She searched in her inbox for clues, uncovering an email from February with the coordinates. Subject line, "We found something." On a clear day, she flew back over the spot. By now, the trees had filled in, green and full, and the plane no longer had the LiDAR machine strapped to its belly to create a map of the scene. Why had she bothered? What could she possibly see from the sky? But still, when she reached the destination, the coordinates forming an imaginary X right below her, her heart paused, and her breath hitched in her chest. Something was different, and it wasn't simply that the foliage had grown in like hair where before there had been only stark, bare branches, or that the sky was blue instead of the cold, dreary gray it had been on the day they'd discovered the wall. She couldn't put her finger on the difference. Still, anxiety filled her chest. She zigged and zagged over the space, twisting the airplane around to pass back over as many times as she could, flying as low as she dared. It was not until hours later, after she had landed, driven home, cooked and eaten her dinner, and stood brushing her teeth, that the epiphany sprouted, that she realized she had missed the obvious. There had been no towering wall of rock in that spot. The valley had vanished. She twisted in her sleep, the question on the edge of her mind. Which had stretched higher on that February afternoon? The naked trees or the column of rock? The morning after Tabitha's flight, her eyes dry and red, she called the Livingston Police Department. She sipped her coffee while the voice on the other end droned on about these missing persons, as if bored by their absence.
"We've been receiving some calls about a missing group of hikers in the area," the voice said, deadpan and bored. "Users from some app or something. Instacart? Instasnap? I don't know about those things. Let me see here. Hold on a second."
The scratchy noise of rustling paper filled the earpiece. Tabitha felt a sinking feeling, like a heavy ball of lead had dropped into her stomach, splashing her coffee, which suddenly tasted bitter, the milk sour. How many missing hikers could there be in the woods near Livingston?
"Ma'am, the calls we got were for someone named Dylan Prescott, who the user said was traveling with her boyfriend, Luke, and they think maybe a couple of other people. Do you recognize that name?"
"I don't," she replied. She slipped her phone away from her face and opened Instagram while the officer babbled about social media and prank calls. She found Dylan's account, the bio reading, "Red River Gorge, always climbing, Petzl athlete."
"We really don't have much to go on," the officer said. "I mean, we get all kinds of weird calls. But we're a small department. We can't go search in the woods every time some teenager wants to make a prank call."
"Officer," Tabitha said, swallowing, "I think my friend Clay was with Dylan, the person you've been getting reports about. He went into the woods off Route 490 in mid-March, and I haven't heard from him since." She offered the coordinates to the officer and hung up. She scrolled down Dylan's feed. The top posts on her account were dark squares, off-brand from the rest of the photos gleaming with smiling faces, harnessed bodies, food or dogs. She clicked open the first photo, pinching to zoom in. She pieced together grainy outlines of leaves. In the top corner, 2 white specks stared back at her. When the Livingston department scouted at the edge of 490, they could not find anything but a skin-and-bones dog with a name tag reading Slade. The dog had its teeth clamped around a large bone. They did not discover the rust-colored Jeep nestled into the woods, nor did they stumble upon Luke's eyeless face, or Sylvia's skeleton, or Clay's spilled guts. They couldn't have. Not yet. The place was not finished with them. It was still digesting. It could not yet let the bones of its meal be uncovered. The ground hardened while it grew full on its flesh and blood dinner. The authorities input Tabitha's coordinates into their outdated equipment,
which promptly malfunctioned, powered down, or took it upon itself to rearrange the numbers, leading them to a bare patch of woods, unearthing only rotten logs and a proliferation of mushrooms in rings, and trees and trees and trees. A few officers, however, came back with goosebumps and wide eyes, swearing they felt something out there in the woods, some weird presence none of them could really describe. Some swore they saw a woman in the distance, hiding behind trees, but she always disappeared when they tried to approach. After the story of the missing hikers started gaining media attention, bored adventurers said they saw the same woman after venturing into the woods. One managed to catch her on grainy footage that spread like a disease, much to the dismay of the tiny Livingston Police Department, who worried that their entire force would soon be dedicated to rescuing idiot teenagers from a patch of woods that had sat quietly on the side of 490 for decades. The video showed a dark silhouette peeking out from behind a tree, the voice of the person filming whispering, asking if anyone else sees it. But as they inched closer, the silhouette transformed into shrubbery. Still, it garnered millions of views and rebuttals, from people debunking it to people claiming the shadowy figure was one of the hikers hiding out in the woods after luring the others there to kill them. Later, the sleep-deprived investigators would replay the footage 1,000 times, trying to sharpen the blurry image. Inside the precinct, the phone rang after each dispatch like clockwork. The officers lifted the phone, knowing the voice on the other end would belong to Tabitha before she spoke. "Did you find anything?" she would ask. "Nothing but trees," they would answer. While the Livingston Police Department sent out officers to hunt for the same goose egg, threatening the assignment to anyone complaining of boredom, wasting money and time with their easily tricked GPS technology, the Earth feasted. 4 months later, Sylvia had almost become her moniker. Nearly every last bit of skin, muscle, sinew, and organ sucked down into the earth. Chunks of flesh slid away from her, flopping onto the mud like a slow-roasted rack of ribs. Any trace bruising along her neck became irrelevant. Clay's handiwork would become impossible to discover. His bony hands had not even squeezed hard enough to crack the delicate bones of her larynx or hyoid. By summer, the humid Kentucky heat worked in tandem with the greedy earth, melting away the last few bits of epidermis left on the top ridges of her body, across the bridge of her nose, on her forehead, letting them slide away like an avalanche. The ghosts tied to that valley had long since had their fill of Clay. His sternum opened like a picnic basket, their first full meal in a long time. Not since they'd sucked the blood from their next newest companions, forever clad in loud 80s jackets. They'd slurped Clay's intestines like never-ending trails of spaghetti noodles, stabbed their teeth into his organs like they were fresh apples. They licked their fingers clean, their ghostly bellies full and satiated, before they found Luke, his body still warm after being murdered by his own girlfriend. Next to him lay a little gleam of steel, the tiny blade sticking out of the dirt. The perfect instrument for their delicate dessert, for all those little morsels sticking out at the edges. While his girlfriend ran into the night, they carved off his toes and fingers, crunching them like carrots. They divvied the exotic offerings, the ones too good to share. The chewy ears, the juicy eyes. The most coveted they fought over before the general returned and claimed it for his own, taking the knife to carefully carve the tongue away, leaving a straight, precise line by Luke's back molars. Full to bursting, they merely sighed when Dylan pushed away from the wall. Let the earth take her. Had she pressed farther into the woods instead of returning to the heart of the valley, to her one true home on the wall, she might have escaped. The site and its residents too engorged to notice one more body at the margins. As the fruitless search wore on, articles about the missing climbers trickled in. A few paragraphs appearing in the local news in Lexington, but spreading once Petzel released a statement about Dylan Prescott, about how saddened they were to hear of her disappearance, how they hoped their brand-new, sparkly client would resurface. Months passed, and the story reached the national stage, with the AP releasing updates, with countless podcasts theorizing where the missing campers could be. Even NPR and the New York Times had published articles about the disappearance, dubbing the area Prescott Pass after Dylan. But it wasn't until fans somehow got a hold of leaked crime scene photos months later that anyone latched on to the biggest quirk, something the investigators hadn't even noticed, distracted by skeletons and missing organs and missing persons. There was no wall. They'd never encountered any type of wall, nothing like the structures in Clay's scans at any point in the investigation. They went there to climb, right? So why hadn't anyone found a wall? Weirder still, a giant gaping hole in the puzzle was that fans were adamant they'd seen the wall in Dylan's few live streams. Tabitha followed the news relentlessly, flew over the site continually. She couldn't believe no one had found the wall yet. She had seen it with her own eyes. Hadn't she? Tabitha continued to call the precinct, but now her calls ended in a voicemail, a pre-recorded cheery voice promising to return the favor and directing news agencies to their new and harried publicist. By now, the campers' parents and family had pressed the department for answers, and the case had spawned, enfolded more detectives from the Kentucky State Police, who streamed bi-weekly updates on the case, likewise uncovering nothing but thousands of trees. Maybe they should chop them all down. Confusing the search was the fact that Dylan's account continued to livestream, sending out grainy and dark clips, soundless and lasting only seconds, yet more pieces of evidence on the heap that added no clarity. Did that mean she was still in the woods? The streams would pop up on occasion, even years later, the itch of discovery returning with each one, reviving crazed, sleepless obsession across the nation. The police would discover nothing until the place slept, until it was satiated. With a full belly and a new group of ghostly victims, it no longer cared if a motorist with a full bladder uncovered the rust-colored Jeep in the trees, if he stumbled and stared at the dirt-streaked sole of Luke's toeless foot. The earth didn't bother to hide Sylvia Skeleton's bones, didn't mind when investigators plucked up each one and placed them into plastic bags. It had had its fill. Let the authorities and morticians ruminate over Luke and Clay and Sylvia. Dylan's body had already been digested beneath it, already set in a grave. That wretched place wanted the rest of them discovered, so the authorities would clean up, returning the spot to pristine wilderness, leaving no trace. This concludes the reading of This Wretched Valley by Jenny Kiefer. Copyright 2024 by Jenny Kiefer. This book was read by Megan Tusing. This unabridged recording was published by arrangement with Quirk Books and was produced in 2024 by Blackstone Publishing, which holds the copyright. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Blackstone Publishing. For a complete list of our titles, visit our website at www.downpour.com. Thank you.